Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Adapting Richmond's Shoreline and Industrial Legacy, a community conversation. My name is Carmen Martinez, and I will be reading Vice Mayor Claudia Jimenez and District 6 Council members' opening speech on her behalf. Today, we gather to address one of the most pressing challenges facing our city, protecting our 32 miles of shoreline, the longest of any city in the Bay Area. This coastline is critical shield against sea level rise, and its protection is essential for the safety and well-being of our communities. But beyond protection, we must also clean up the toxic legacy that threatens our most vulnerable residents. Richmond is at the forefront of the fight against climate chaos. Our city, home to the largest refinery on the West Coast, suffers from some of the worst rates of asthma and other chronic illnesses due to the ongoing pollution from Chevron's operations. Sea level rise could amplify these existing threats, spreading contaminants from toxic sites along our southern shoreline, like the Blair landfill and the AstraZeneca, into the homes of Richmond residents. Industry and government have shared responsibility to clean up these contaminated sites, removing all chemical and radiological threats to ensure the safety of current and future generations. We need stronger coordination among the multiple agencies overseeing our region's shoreline to develop solutions that benefit the entire community and protect our economic future. I'm also committed to ensuring that our existing ecosystems are preserved. Point Malati, for instance, is home to the osprey nesting sites and eelgrass beds that must be protected. The city will work closely with the East Bay Regional Park, since they now own and are responsible for stewarding the land, to guarantee the community vision gets implemented. Today's conversation is about how we build resilience in the face of sea level rise, climate disasters, and industrial legacies. Richmond has the potential for climate resilience planning to protect public infrastructure and mitigate flooding risk. This is a pivotal moment, and your voices and ideas are key to shaping Richmond's future. With the recent Chevron settlement of $550 million, the Council's intention is to use the money to fund city infrastructure and a plan for just transition. I support the full implementation of our coal transport and storage ban. These efforts are part of my larger vision for a fossil fuel-free Richmond, a vision that will create a safe, healthier, and more equitable future for all of us. Now, I would like to introduce Lucy Gill, representing the Confederate villages of the Lishawn Nation, who will share a special welcome on behalf of Karina Gould.
Good afternoon, and thank you so much for inviting the Confederated Villages of Lishawn Nation to be a part of this wonderful event today. We are so grateful to be partners from the beginning in these important conversations about sea level rise in our traditional territories, the lands and waters now known as Alameda, Contra Costa, and San Joaquin counties, and parts of Napa and Solano counties along the waterways. We find ourselves as human beings in a critical time of having to find our way back to being in right relationship with our Mother Earth. We are being called to come together as people from all walks of life to bring our most open and creative minds together to relearn our responsibilities for not only our future, but for the future of all living beings. Lishawn Nation is looking towards ways to increase habitat areas for our animal and plant relatives to survive, creating habitats that allow them to move to higher ground as the water rises. We also want to protect our ancient monuments, the shell mounds that are our villages and burial sites along the shore. We are interested in bringing back our traditional oysters as a nature-based solution to sea level rise, while also recreating a sustainable ecosystem and providing food for our people. We are also concerned about the health of our bays. We would like to see corporations forced to clean up the years of toxins that have polluted our waters. Today, the waters that have fed our people since time immemorial have become so sick that humans can no longer eat from them in a way that is safe or sustainable. These businesses cannot be allowed to close down and move away to only pollute the waters more as the waters rise. They must be held accountable for their years of gross negligence. Even though we are facing climate crisis, there is great hope that we can reverse some of the damage that humans have done to the Bay Area over the last 2 centuries. From our perspective as Indigenous people, California is a recent creation. We can remediate the pollution, we can daylight creeks and create microclimates again. We can welcome back the salmon and the steelhead trout and remember our lives in reciprocity with all other living beings. We look forward to working with everyone to create solutions that will sustain the next 7 generations, so that those that are yet to be born have fresh water to drink, good air to breathe, good soil to grow foods and medicine, and a renewed relationship with our relative fire. Thank you all for bringing your good hearts and minds together today.
Thank you, Lucy. Now, I'm delighted to introduce our moderator for today's event, Julia Dowell, a senior field organizer from Sierra Club, and Zoom moderator, Elizabeth Felter, climate planner and ESA Environmental Science Associates. Julia will help guide us through this vital conversation. So once again, thank you all for being here today and to the organizers of the event. And let's get started.
Good afternoon. My name is Julia Dowell, and I'm thrilled to be your moderator today. I'm an environmental organizer and environmental justice advocate. Today, we are here to discuss the impacts of sea level rise to the Richmond shoreline and Richmond's legacy of industry. Today's panels will follow the arc from problems to solutions. I'd like to encourage you to please stay until the end of the event today, as each speaker will add an important piece to this conversation. Before we begin, a few important housekeeping items. Please do not eat in the chambers. Water is okay. We will have a break for refreshments. The restrooms are out these doors on the left. And in case of emergencies, there are exits behind you and right to your left up here. This is a hybrid event, so we have folks on Zoom and in person, and we will have time for Q&A after each panel. Now I'd like to introduce you to our first panel titled Options for Richmond. The panelists include Contra Costa County Supervisor John Joya, Richmond City Council member Cesar Zepeda, and the Director of Community Development for the City of Richmond, Lena Velasco. Unfortunately, Doria Robinson is unable to be here with us today because of a family emergency. We hope that she will give her presentation at a future community meeting. Please give our panelists a warm welcome. Okay, so I would first like to introduce County Supervisor John Joya, who is also a commissioner on the Bay Conservation Development Commission.
Great. Thank you. Thanks. First, thanks for spending half of Saturday away from whatever else we were going to do today on this really important topic. And I do want to do a call out first. I see David Helvarg here because, we are dealing with the coast and the bay. And David has a great book out called Golden Shore, California's Love Affair with the Sea, right? Great book. And, as you think about it, we're so fortunate here in California in the Bay Area to have to be near the water, which is really the basis of who we are as a region, but also now we're addressing sea level rise, and it's causing issues for us, and how do we as communities address it? So I'm going to talk more from a regional perspective, and I've had a chance to serve on the Bay Conservation and Development Commission since 1999, and I also am the vice chair of the San Francisco Bay Restoration Authority, which is funding actually a resiliency project along the North Richmond shoreline. It's you all know about Measure AA, the $12 a year parcel tax that we pay for wetland restoration. I helped co-write Measure AA, and we put it on the ballot. It passed with 70%. And I say that because I think it shows that people in the Bay Area care about the Bay and care about the coastline. Think about that. 70% of residents in the Bay Area voted to tax themselves $12 per parcel to improve wetland restoration. So the first message I have in all of this is that we need to address sea level rise from a regional standpoint. because what happens in one part of the bay affects another. And I'm glad to say Richmond and Contra Costa County are already being very proactive in addressing this issue. So I want to turn the clock back. Back in the 1960s, 3 women from Berkeley and El Cerrito fought to form Save San Francisco Bay Association, Save the Bay. And they formed Save the Bay to protect our shorelines from getting filled in, to protect the bay from getting smaller. And it led to the establishment of the Bay Conservation Development Commission. Both Caesar and I serve on that. And the goal is to prevent filling of the bay, to provide public access along the bay. And yet now we are faced in a way with the reverse of that. How do we protect the bay from getting bigger and impacting the shoreline? And how do we do that in an environmentally responsible way? So it's interesting that BCDC is now taking on this planning role from first protecting the bay from getting smaller to now addressing sea level rise. And I'm glad to say that BCDC has really been working with all the counties in the Bay Area to develop vulnerability assessments. What does it look like in your region? What are the most vulnerable areas? And we know here in West Contra Costa, the North Richmond shoreline is the most vulnerable area. There's other areas along the South Richmond shoreline, but the North Richmond shoreline is the most vulnerable area. And under a relatively new state law, every city and county in the Bay Area that touches the bay is required to file a regional shoreline adaptation plan. They have to develop this plan in a number of years, but we're starting early in Richmond and Contra Costa. And BCDC was empowered under state law to develop the guidelines for this plan and to review these plans, and is providing technical support to all the cities and counties. And in Contra Costa, we've received about $1.5 million to work on this plan. Richmond has gotten funding as well. And what we're doing is trying to align also the other cities along the Contra Costa shoreline, the 90 miles of shoreline that we have, many of them smaller cities that may not have the capacity to do these plans, to work with us. And we are partnering with Richmond as well. And I just want to call out Ryan Hernandez, who actually staffs this effort at our counties and our planning department. And so we're taking this very seriously. I chair our county's Board of Supervisors Resiliency Committee. So we are working on a Contra Costa plan, and Richmond's working on a plan, and we're going to work together. Again, to think about it, that you can't, this is not a problem that's solved one city by one city. It has to be solved regionally. Why should we be working on this regionally? Well, first, it allows us to coordinate our efforts. As I've said, if we don't do it together, there's a lot of unintended consequences from that, and we will not have a plan that's very effective. We also want to work together on, oh, Dana, you're here. I didn't see you. Dana Breckwald is with BCDC and is leading the Bay Area-wide effort. I'm chairing a Bay Area local electeds task force on this, where we're working with local officials in every 9 of the 9 counties. So good to see you, Dana. And we want to really get resources to address it. The cost of doing nothing to address sea level rise is more expensive than the cost of addressing it, right? If there's a reason to do something, there's many reasons, but also because it is way more expensive just to not do anything. And we also want to address the most vulnerable communities. There's a lot of lower-income communities that will be impacted, like in Rodeo and North Richmond and in Bay Point, other parts of Richmond, and we really need to focus this also from an environmental justice standpoint. I think we can develop regional projects together. For example, we are working on a project along the North Richmond shoreline that actually was developed with the North Richmond community to create what's called a living levee or horizontal levee. It's not a levee you can see. It's not like concrete. It's really changing the profile of the bay, building wetlands, doing wetland restoration. So it's a more natural based solution, and it protects the North Richmond shoreline and the West County Wastewater District plant. I know Caesar was on the West County Wastewater District board when we started that project, and it's getting a fair amount of funding from the San Francisco Bay Restoration Authority that I serve on. So the idea, think about it, a project developed by the community, working with regional agencies that improves community access to the bay, improves wetland restoration, and provides shoreline resiliency along those creeks, Wildcat and San Pablo Creeks, and along the shoreline. I mean, and we're involving community engagement, and that's going to be a common theme we talk about, the importance of doing this work, not just among agencies, but with community, like today, that it is important to have that voice as we do that work. I also wanted to just point out that, and I know that a lot of the topic later will also be the industrial shoreline, and I'm glad to see DTSC, the Department of Toxic Substances Control, here today, because there are issues of how does sea level rise impact the contaminated sites. I think we're unique in many parts, in many ways, in that we have this history of industry along the shoreline, and therefore have to also address contamination issues. And I know that's going to be a subject of discussion, and Sherry's been working a lot on that issue over the years with the Zeneca site and others, Pam. So I'm really excited. I'm not going to go on much longer because there's going to be a lot of discussion. We're open for questions, but really to say, Contra Costa and Richmond are really at the forefront. I'm glad to see there's folks from Marin here too. I know you're doing good work, but we're really trying to meet the state requirement really early in developing our plans. We're optimistic that we will have more community involvement and appreciate the partnership we have with community. So thanks for being here today, and look forward to our discussion.
Thank you, Supervisor Joya. Now I will pass the mic to Councilmember Zepeda, who also serves as a BCDC Commissioner, to discuss planning for sea level rise, deadlines, and funding.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. And how do I follow County Supervisor John Joya? For a moment there, I thought he was going to give all my notes that I had. I was like, all right, you don't need me. But good afternoon. I'm Councilmember Cesar Zepeda, and I also sit on the BCDC board along with my colleague here, John Joya. So here's a little bit of information. I was asked to come out and give timelines and deadlines on the RASP, on the plan that's coming out. And we're right at the beginning of it. If I go, does this work?
I could be your staff. I'll staff you.
Next. Okay, here we go. So the draft regional shoreline adaptation plan, or the deadline here, started a couple days ago. So a couple of things to notice here. Started September 16th through October 18th, if you didn't already know about it. And I'm going to talk a little bit about it and then where you can go to give your public input. So please come out and help us finalize the RASP by reviewing the draft and providing comments. You can visit the BCDC website, and on there's more information. You could also join us for the commissioner meeting on October 17th at 1 o'clock to provide your comments either virtually or in person. So there's a lot of different ways to get us that information. We want to make sure, and as you'll see, part of the plan is that the decisions, even though the Supervisor John Joya and myself and others sit on the board and we'll be the ones that actually vote, we want to make sure that we vote on what the community wants. So your feedback is very important so that we know which way we're going. Next slide, please. As you might already know, last year, the California State Legislature passed SB 272 by Senator Laird, and it was a sea level rise planning and adaptation plan. SB 272 addresses the need for coordinated standardized sea level rise adaptation by requiring local governments along the San Francisco Bay shoreline to develop this plan. And the project kickoff started last year in 2023. And you can see the timeline and where we are today. We are in the public comment period, September through October. And then we'll move on to the commission vote and potential adoption of it sometime between November and December. And then continuing the mapping platform to February 2025. Excuse me. And again, the RAS will guide the creation of coordinated, locally planned sea level rise adaptation actions that work together to meet the regional goals. So this is not just for Richmond, this is not just for one city, this is not just for one county, but this is for all together. Next slide, please. The RAPS is being guided and developed by the broad range of stakeholders, as I was mentioning. One stakeholder is the BCDC Commission, the Rising Sea Level Commissioner Working Group, the local elected regional task force that I also sit along with Supervisor Joya, the advisory group, and then the most important is the community, the broader community, which is everyone here giving that feedback. Multiple ways, again, of getting your feedback to us. One, going to the Bay Adapt website or the BCDC website. You could email your public comments, or you could come out in person, or you can join in over Zoom on October 17th. Next slide. Some of the minimum standards that they're going to be having here for coastal flood hazards and sea level rise scenario standards. One, sea level rise inundation, 100-year storm surge, shallow and emerging groundwater, 0.8 feet, 3.1 feet, 4.9 feet, and 6.6 feet scenarios. So that's what they will be looking at. Minimum categories, required assets by BCDC. I'm going this a little bit fast because I only have 2 minutes, but we can ask some more questions later. It's something also very important is the equity assessment standards. In District 2, I have, out of the 32 miles of shoreline in Richmond, I have the majority of it, and then Councilmember McLaughlin has the other. But altogether, Richmond has 32 miles of shoreline, and along our shoreline, we have lower income communities that are already fully built out, and they were built out before sea level rise was a thought to some people. So equity is very, very important to me, especially because of my communities that are right around those areas. The adaptation strategy standards maximize benefits of water-dependent shoreline uses and bayland habitats, improve community health, economic development, infrastructure, and housing needs, and create pathways to respond to changing flood risks over time. As we're still learning more, I feel like every time I come out to an event about sea level rise, I learn something new because it's constantly changing. Right? We don't know what's going to really happen. We're planning for what we know, but we also have to plan for what we don't know, and how do we create a community that can easily adapt. Next, please. Key themes for local electeds and planners, and I put this on here for those that are elected officials or decision makers, and also for some of our planners. Center equity and sharing decision-making with the community. So again, very, very important that we lead with the community first. Planning with consistent science and coordinated with neighbors. Consider long-term implications of how adaptation will need to change, as I just mentioned. Incorporate multi-benefit approaches. Rely on land use and policy tools for long-term decisions. Incorporate codes and standards for adaptive change. So all this is conversation that we'll be having further with our city planners and the county planners, et cetera. Next slide. What should your communities know about the plan? It prioritizes equitable process and resources for frontline environmental justice communities. It encourages reduced risk to their existing homes. And that's a crucial piece, the existing homes. Because again, we don't know this was happening. As Supervisor Joya mentioned before, we were trying to figure out how to not shrink the bay. Now we're figuring out how to make sure the bay is not shrinking us. So that's going to be a really big problem there for the houses that are already built. It ensures that flood safety is considered for new development. They can continue to enjoy recreational areas, habitats, and access to nature. They can continue to rely on resources, movement of goods, transportation, and transit. Richmond has our ports. How do we make sure that our ports are still usable as we continue this plan? This was mentioned as well, prioritizing the cleanup of contaminated sites. Unfortunately, Richmond has a lot of those. So as we continue to plan, how do we make sure that we plan the contaminated sites along with the communities already built? Thank you. And then again, I keep putting this up there because it's really, really want to make sure that we hear from the community how to participate in public comment. Go to our website, email with the subject line RSAP or RASP, and attend a public hearing on October 17th. Next slide. I think this might be it. That is it. But I look forward to getting your feedback, and thank you for being out here. And I just want to mention about AA. As our supervisor was mentioning, I remember talking to some people when I was out there promoting to vote for AA, and someone said, why should I vote for it? You guys keep taxing us. Why? And I was like, look, you live in the flatlands. I live at Hilltop. If you want to make Hilltop a beach level community, go for it. And they look at me and they go, wait, what? I'm like, yeah, like the sea level is going to continue rising if we don't do something. And if we don't plan today, you're going to make Hilltop a beach community. And I know that may hopefully never happen. But I was trying to exaggerate for them to think of what could happen if we're not investing. And I'm glad that AA passed. And this was years ago, and now we have that money to continue investing in our community. And another little tidbit of communicating and making sure that our youth know what's happening. I also I'm the city council liaison for our youth commission. And I was inviting them to this event. And I was telling them about sea level rise. And they said, what is that? I was like, oh, okay, this is an opportunity. So we need to make sure that we continue the conversation for our youth, that they know that this is happening, that this is a real thing, and that we need to be able to plan and come together and bring that future generation into this conversation. So thank you so much again. I think my time's up, but I look forward to presenting some more. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Council Member. Now I will pass it to Lena Velasco to discuss Rising Together, the role of community engagement in sea level rise adaptation.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. It's really great to see a lot of old and new faces, and really excited to be able to share what our goals will be in the next coming years in terms of getting this plan adopted. So, next slide, please. I just wanted to talk a little bit about why is engagement important to us as the city, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about what we're planning to do in the next couple of years and how you can get involved, as well as your neighbors, your organizations, and other agencies that are here as well. So we acknowledge that the community holds a lot of information, and so this gives us an opportunity as city decision makers, bringing forward plans that are informed by your knowledge and your priorities. And so we're very much interested in hearing how you all would like to see our adaptation tailored here in Richmond. We also believe it builds trust so that as we begin to solve problems, we're able to talk to each other, have open dialogues, even when we may not agree, but that we're having these conversations that can inform our decisions on how we move forward. In addition, I don't want this plan to be a city plan. I want you to acknowledge this is our plan. This is how we're going to do adaptation in our community, as well as just enhancing our resiliency. When we work together, we do better. In addition, equity and inclusivity. We want to make sure that the diversity in Richmond is reflected in our engagement. And so we'll be talking about different opportunities on how we plan to do that to make sure that we're touching everybody who may be affected by sea level rise. In addition, crisis preparedness. We want to make sure when the next crisis does happen, we know who to call, how to work together, how to solve problems. And so we're really looking forward to talking to you all on sea level rise and where your priorities lie. Next slide. So why should you get involved? You are our experts. You also bring diverse perspectives to the table. And then ownership. We do understand that there will be different questions about how Richmond adaptation occurs, and so we want you to own the decisions as well as the adaptation measures. And then we just want to build the advocacy power. So the more people that are involved, the more we can go to the city council as well as build support for the projects that will follow the plan adoption. Because I don't believe in just adopting plans, I believe in implementing plans. And so I think if we're able to build the partnership, we're able to seek the funding to pursue the projects that we identified together. Next slide. So what is Richmond doing in the next couple of years? So I just wanted to share some good news. You know, the city council did ask staff to issue a request for proposals where we would get a consultant to support us, and they had allocated a certain amount of budget. And so we did that. We selected Methuen and ESA to award the contract. So they are now on contract with the city. We also wanted to partner with the community-based organization, so we also did a request for proposals, and we selected the Watershed Project to help support this work, engaging community residents, other community-based organizations, as well as, you know, we had some Richmond residents, Sally and Pam, who came to the city, along with Councilor McLaughlin, who let us know that the OPC had funding available that could help expand the work and further support it. So with that information, we hit the ground running, and we worked with ESA and Methuen, and we were able to get an application in. And happy to announce that we were awarded the $1.5 million. So we're able to now supplement the county's efforts and really do a detailed engagement process, but also plan for Richmond. And we're hoping to really identify very specific short-term projects that we can pursue funding for. So that is part of the goals here. It's not just to come with a list of projects, but to begin to evaluate and do some CEQA analysis about implementation. Next slide. So what will be some of the key elements is our plan will be SB 272 compliant. That is going to be paramount for us. We do want to meet this obligation that the city will have, which means that it will be subject to BCDC review and approval. We will be conducting a community-based collaborative planning process. So that is a key part of our plan. It will include community visioning. So we really want to understand what the priorities that will guide the adaptation measure from the community. So what are your priorities to be implemented into the plan? In addition, we'll be updating our vulnerability assessment. The issue of contaminated sites is an important one to us that, you know, we understand agencies may not be fully aligned. You know, BCDC has its guidance, DTSC may have its guidance, the city may have its guidance, and so this is an opportunity to all of us talk and hopefully coordinate activities as well. We are anticipating it's going to be about a 24-month process. And so there will be some longevity in that. If we can accelerate, we will try as best as possible, but just being realistic of, you know, what a community conversation would be. As noted, we will be coordinating with the county, so we have talked already to county staff. We understand that a lot of the information we're collecting is also useful for the county's efforts and vice versa, so we will be doing a lot of information sharing as well as actually coordinating amongst events. So thank you, Ryan, for being here and other staff, because he's already taking the information he's hearing here in Richmond and putting it towards the countywide plan. So what do we hope to accomplish? A shared understanding of our vulnerability. So what is Richmond's vulnerability? Understanding based on the priorities that you've identified. There may be some community assets that may not already be mapped in city databases. And so we want to hear from you. What are the things that we're trying to protect? In addition, we want to bring forward a broad range of interested parties to help us identify what those priorities are. And then we want the information that we're collecting to help guide updates to our land use policies and permitting processes. You know, the general plan update goes to 2030, or the general plan, and so we will be starting a general plan update in the next year or so, and so this is also an opportunity to inform changes within the general plan. And then as well as establishing the partnerships. So we do understand adaptation isn't going to occur in 1 or 2 years. It's a long-term process. And so to begin to identify who, what opportunities are being brought to the table and shared. Because, again, the OPC grant, as much as we try to keep on top of every grant source that's available, it was really helpful to have somebody come to us and say, like, hey, we think there's this great opportunity. So we're looking forward to the partnerships that we're all going to bring. Next slide. So just in terms of our scope of work, we are very much looking to engage the youth. We do understand, this has a long-term horizon, but affects us all. So Councilmember Cepeda definitely going to talk to you more about the Youth Council or Youth Commission, but as well as any community-based organizations that's working with youth in Richmond, please reach out to us. We would love to come to you, share information about the plan and why it's important. We'll be doing study sessions in front of the Planning Commission and in front of the City Council to really talk about the issues, as well as doing some community-wide workshops, and as best as possible, we'll be coordinating with other regional efforts. And then as well, doing surveys and polls, doing educational programs, having discussions. Today is a very pivotal information point around contaminated sites. We do think that we'll be doing engagement that's very focused on specific topics. So if there are topics around sea level rise that you would want us to talk about more, dive in deeper, really looking forward to the next panel and the information they're going to bring to the table, as well as just interactive online platforms, and definitely share with us if there's any information or assets that you would want us to promote. So just in terms of next steps, we have to go back to council to authorize acceptance of our grant agreement with the OPC. We'll be working with the OPC as well to confirm the grant scope. We're really excited that BCDC has released its draft guidelines and it's nearing adoption, so we'll be using that to help inform our scope of work. And then we'll go back to council as well to amend our consultant contract. And so we do think that that's going to take a little bit of pause between today and getting those specific tasks completed. So we'll be hopefully kicking off in full steam in early 2025, but certainly we'll be sharing additional information, and just really excited about today, and thank you all for your participation.
Thank you so much to our wonderful panelists. Can we get another round of applause? Okay, we now have a few minutes for a Q&A from the audience. As I said, this is a hybrid meeting, so we'll be doing Q&A in the room, and then we'll do some Q&A from our Zoom participants. So we'll have about 7 minutes for Q&A in the room. Please raise your hand if you have a question. If you're on Zoom, you can also use the raise hand function, and someone will bring the mic to you, and then our wonderful panelists will offer a response. So are there any questions from the audience? Okay. The mic is coming to you.
Joe Pulio. I had a conversation with the Chevron environmental guy during the modernization, and he was very defensive about their environmental program. Then I asked him, well, what is Standard Oil buried out there in the last 100 years? And he went silent. Is there any program to assess before Chevron closes down what kind of pollution is buried out there?
Let me make a general comment about some of the Chevron involvement. So when we started our project, and I'll get to your question, when we started our North Richmond Shoreline resiliency project with the West County Wastewater District being the lead, we wanted to include all the property owners along that Shoreline. We wanted to include Republic Services at the landfill, the small property owners, and the refinery, right? Because all of that, the whole Shoreline benefits when all the property owners are involved. And Republic Services, they operated the landfill, said, yeah, we want to follow, we want to see what's going on, we know it affects our landfill. And it's interesting, Chevron's response was, well, we know it's an issue, but we don't want to get too involved because, they were sued by a number of jurisdictions, including Richmond, about the impact of oil companies on climate change. And for some reason, they felt that if they were getting involved on shoreline resiliency projects, it would show their culpability. Well, my response to them was, look, you, like everybody else, need to address sea level rise for the benefit of all of us, and that's separate from the culpability issue. But so far, they have shied away from being involved with this North Richmond project. I think they should, because, they have responsibility as well, clearly, but they have not been engaged. So I just wanted to make that general comment. That's been their position, unfortunately. As to the issue of toxics, I think, DTSC's here. There's going to be a lot of need to address that site and other industrial sites along the way, and I don't know if DTSC has jurisdiction. I know I'm on the Air District. We address refinery emissions. I don't know. I don't think we have any particular jurisdiction on the contamination issue in the soil. That may be DTSC. So that would be maybe an opportunity for DTSC, who's here, to, whether there is some ability for them to help. But I think that is an issue. It's an important issue for all these industrial sites along the waterfront. I do not know an answer to what would exist there. And I don't know, Lena, if you, from a planning standpoint, the city's looking at that, but it is an important issue I want to acknowledge. But so far they have shied away, unfortunately, from being proactive on the sea level rise issue. Hopefully that will change. There are some other refineries in this county that actually did participate in some discussions about vulnerability. And so that's good. We want all of those along the shoreline to participate.
Yeah, I think as well with the expanded scope that we have from OPC, we have more opportunity to update data and more mapping. So we will certainly be reaching out to large property owners. One of the things we will be looking at as well is the Port of Richmond. I think when the council had limited funds, they excluded that. But with the OPC funding, we'll be going back to council asking that be reconsidered, because we do think that the working industry that exists now is an important component to plan for with adaptation measures, and certainly as a large landowner just on the sort of San Pablo Bay, North Richmond coastline.
All right, we have another question in the audience. The mic is coming to you.
Hi, my name is Sue. I got a question the other day that I want to hand off to the experts here, which is that I'm looking at a map. There's 5 acres of land at the southernmost terminal of Marina Bay South in the Marina Bay neighborhood. And I'm told, so it's sort of, if you think of it, it's directly east of Rosie the Riveter. So there's a field there. And there's at least preliminary discussions or plans of putting 70 units of new housing on that piece of property right up against the shore. And the folks I was talking to at the Marina Bay Neighborhood Council, a lot of them thought that was a bad idea, sea level rise being one of the reasons for it. And so I guess my question is for community members who want to sort of join the discussion about the appropriateness of building and developing new housing on the shoreline, what should we steer them towards in terms of participation? Is that giving comments on the RASP? Is that sort of the first entry point for that?
Well, there's, I guess, double response. One is certainly it's a project that's under review. So the public can opine and share information regarding that project now. So I don't recall who the project planner is, but I would certainly contact the planner and see if you can get additional information. But I think in terms of this is part of the discussion, and we'll have multiple layers of legislation that we will have to contend with. But certainly the vulnerability assessment, the adaptation planning may include recommendations for rezoning property that once was anticipated or is currently planned for development as an adaptation measure. I do think that that's going to be part of the conversation and the discourse that we have, but we may need to amend our general plan to restrict development in certain locations as an adaptation measure. So I certainly recommend for that project specific, talk to the planner, but do acknowledge that we, as a community, may have recommendations to the council around land use.
And one of the things I just wanted to say about land use, one of the things, the good news is Richmond is on the forefront of looking at this. The concern is there's a lot of cities around the Bay that may not be approaching it the way we are, which is exactly why BCDC was formed. BCDC was formed because there were some cities, including Berkeley back in the 60s, that were filling the Bay. And BCDC was the first agency in the United States to actually have land use authority senior to a city or county for a defined area, in this case, 100 feet of the shoreline. So it could stop a city from filling the Bay. We don't quite have all of that jurisdiction. I think there's some who are talking about the need to maybe change our authority, because there could be cities who actually let development happen that in a way that's less responsible to address sea level rise, and BCDC may not have authority to stop that. So it's an interesting dynamic that's happening, which is why I think regionalism is really important here, because some cities may not do the right thing.
Okay, we're now going to transfer to Zoom questions, and then if we have time, we'll come back to in-person questions. We will have other Q&A opportunities today, so don't worry. I will pass it to our Zoom moderator.
Hi, we have a question from Jacob online. Hi, Jacob. You are now unmuted. Please ask your question.
Hi. I'm curious where the discussion is on engineering solutions. Like, what are the different options and trade-offs for different ways like engineering projects can help?
I'll talk generally, and maybe others here talk more specifically. I think, in the region, we're looking a lot at nature-based solutions, but there may be the need for some engineered solutions. I think San Francisco may be looking at some issues on seawall along the Embarcadero. Our project out in North Richmond is engineered, but it's not like concrete engineering, right? It's an engineered solution about the bay and about the profile of the bay to increase resiliency and include wetland restoration. So there's engineering involved in all of these things. So I'm not sure in your question if you're asking about concrete engineering, but I think we're trying to have nature-based solutions, and in some cases there may be a need for more. The plans that are being developed, though, are more general. I'm not sure that they're project-oriented. They're more, what are the strategies that we address? And then every community is going to have to look at how do they meet the goals of resiliency. And in some cases, there may be engineered projects. It just depends. But again, I don't think all of the projects don't need to be.
Yeah, and I'll just add that part of the information we need is what are the site constraints to make those determinations, and then what's there, so I think it's part of the engagement process and the analysis and evaluation that we'll be doing as the plan develops.
And just to get a sense of scale, so the estimate is it will cost $110 billion around the bay to address sea level rise. If we do nothing, the cost will be $230 billion. Which is also why we need to come up with some regional ways to help fund these solutions. Obviously, sometimes the development may pay for it, but how do we sort of share this cost? It's a huge cost, right?
And I want to add a little bit there, too. It's a great question, Jacob, and I want to put this question back out there to people that have new ideas. I've been approached by a couple of companies that are now thinking outside the box and saying, what can we do with sea level rise other than putting up a wall, other than doing, they're coming up with very creative solutions. And I can't mention their name yet, but people are approaching with new innovative ideas on sea level rise. How can we make sure that we protect our communities in ways that we maybe haven't thought about before? But stay tuned, because there's going to be more information coming out, and maybe some of these companies, whenever they're ready to go public, they can mention some of their ideas out there. But it's great because our community is going to have the opportunity to really think outside that box, and how do we protect our sea level rise community.
Are there more questions on Zoom? And thank you so much to our panelists.
Yes, there's one more question on Zoom in the chat. This question is from Larry Lem. Larry's question is, the plan has a 100-year flood event covered. Since California is an earthquake-prone area, what events related to tsunamis are covered in our planning?
It's a great suggestion. I mean, I think this is part of the analysis. We will certainly do what's required based on the BCDC guidelines, but there's no prohibition of us looking at issues. We do have a small section of Richmond that is considered a tsunami zone, so certainly appreciate the comment and the suggestion to look at that further.
Okay, do we have any other questions on Zoom?
Yes, one more just came in. This question is from Kelsey Pertula. Kelsey's question is, can anyone talk about what Foster City did with their seawall? Is Richmond considering something so extreme? Or how this plan compares to their seawall in terms of size and expense?
I want to say something. Foster City is one of the reasons BCDC got formed, because it was one of the last communities that's pretty much all fill. And that happened before, that would never have happened had BCDC been in existence, right? So I don't know about, and Lena may know about the specifics of that, but I just wanted to say there's a lot of history there, because it is a city with significant vulnerabilities, given that it was Bay Fill back in the 1960s or 70s, and it shows you when you have irresponsible, fill at the time, how you placed a city at great risk, and Foster City is dealing with that.
And I'll just note that for Richmond, we haven't decided how we're going to adapt yet. But again, the earlier question about engineered solution versus nature-based, I think there's a desire, as expressed by our council, to have nature-based solutions as being the priority. And certainly I think the BCDC guidance also has that. But, so this is, again, part of the analysis. We have not selected, but I would not see Richmond going that extreme as Foster City.
And I don't know if and Dana, if you want to comment anything about this, the whole issue of taking on issues like liquefaction and tsunami. I mean, I actually live on the Bay Shoreline, and on an area of the old Kaiser shipyards, and on maps it's shown as a high risk for liquefaction. Sherry, you're in the same area. So, for a lot of the Richmond shoreline has risk for liquefaction as well, and after a major earthquake, and sea level rise, right, interplays with that. So I don't know, does the plan, how can we address those issues in these plans as well? I don't know, Dana, if you wanted to, could I just ask her?
It's part of what I put in this.
Oh, you're going to address it later on?
Well,
Gail?
I wrote the agenda report for the item to hire a consultant for
Right,
this plan.
to look at that.
And I did bring out the fact that liquidation.
Yeah, liquefaction is important,
that
yeah, right.
liquefaction is something that needs to be considered,
Yeah,
so
good,
I would
yeah,
say
good,
it should
yeah,
be part of this.
Good. What does the guidance, draft guidance say on that? I don't remember.
Yeah, we don't include it. Legally, SB 272 is to address flood hazards along the
Right.
shoreline, so it wasn't legally required for us to include. We do have a standard that talks about looking at additional factors that could impact a shoreline flood control solution. So, for example, if you're building a levee, you need to make sure that it's not going to fail if liquefaction occurs. And every city can, of course, we also really encourage people to look at these sub-regional shoreline adaptation plans in coordination with local hazard mitigation plans. So in that case, you can look at how the different hazards overlay with one another. And if you do have an area of liquefaction and sea level rise, that's a major factor in deciding how you want to change your land use there in the future. They're just not required in our plans by
Right.
law.
David. What is David?
Thank you
David had
so
a hand.
much.
David had some.
I believe that's all the time we have for questions. Do we have time? Okay, sorry. We can take one more question. I think David Helvarg.
Yeah, just we're looking at Hurricane Helena and its effects aren't just storm surge, but precipitation. It's now North Carolina's having its second 1,000-year flood in 3 weeks. I'm just wondering if there's enough flexibility here to deal with the other effects we'll be seeing in the future disasters and be able to direct some of this funding to like storm drain management and sewage upgrade for the city of Richmond.
I think what we're going to do, I mean, when we kick off the project and the vulnerability assessment, I think, I'm taking notes obviously today as well as our consultant team and as we develop the work plan. But I agree. I mean, a lot of our infrastructure, our water treatment plant is affected by sea level rise. And so we will be looking at how infrastructure is impacted by both sea level rise. And then I think when you add in king tide and rain, 100-year floods. So there's a lot to look at. I think we will be limited on funding, but certainly we'll try to do as much as we can and make it as comprehensive.
Lena mentioned funding, so I'm going to put in a plug for Proposition 5. Right now, school bonds only need 55%. They used to be 2/3. Prop 5 would lower the threshold to approve city and county bonds like infrastructure to address sea level rise, flooding, affordable housing from 2/3 to 55. Right now, schools only need 55% to build bonds to build schools. Cities and counties, we need 2/3 to build the infrastructure. Prop 5 would lower that to 55. It's right on the border right now. It's going to be close. So I just wanted to put a plug for Prop 5 because, as Lena said, there's going to be a lot of infrastructure costs to address this, clean water issues, resiliency, infrastructure, and we need to be able to issue bonds with lower than 2/3. It's almost impossible to get 2/3.
Okay, thank you. I believe we have one more question on Zoom, and then we'll take one more in-person question.
Yeah, this question is from the chat from Yvonne McHugh. Yvonne's question is, the retention ponds at the Richmond Chevron site would definitely be problematic with sea level rise. How would they be made to address this issue if they are not participating in the sea level rise planning effort?
I think there's certainly going to be a desire from the city for them to participate in the process. I mean, they're such a large landowner as well as an industry in the city. So, if they choose to not voluntarily participate, then we may have to make some assumptions around the property as well as, some site-specific analysis when projects do come forward. So we'll continue to engage, and I'm sure our council members here as well will, encourage them to participate in the process because, we do know and they acknowledge that it will affect them as well.
Yeah, a little bit. So I've been working alongside with BCDC on this question on how to work with Chevron and then how to work with the other refineries up and down the state as well. But for me, it's Chevron. I've also been speaking with Chevron to push them a little bit to participate. And if they decide still not to, then I think we're going to have to bring a city council item forward to make sure that every property line within our shoreline participates in this conversation in one way or the other. But so I think that they will come to the table willingly, one way or the other. But that is a big, big push that we're going to do.
Okay, thank you. We're going to take one last question for this Q&A session.
I'm also tailgating on the Chevron question. Yeah, I'm sorry. Why am I doing that?
Hold it closer to your mouth.
What's that?
Hold it closer.
Closer, okay. Given that they had a pesticide plant, Ortho, Hensley Avenue, xylene, Hensley, oxide, that whole area, which is heavily blocked off, right off of Castro. There was a pesticide plant, Ortho, which was, in my youth, famous. Everybody knew about it, just like they knew about Stauffer. I did a little research trying to find out anything. Very impossible. There was no access to any information. Given the wonderful work that's been done to kind of uncover what the issues were around the Stauffer plant, or as we know, Zeneca, you would think that transparency is going to be one of the foremost issues. The toxic issue, sea level rises now. The toxic issue has been around for many, many decades. And it's so nice that it's now being addressed through sea level rise. So my question, is there a question there? Transparency, isn't that a requirement? Wouldn't that be something, how can we move forward if we don't know where we are? And they participate, they are part of our community. It doesn't have to be adversarial, but we do need clarity. If I'm gonna give my child some food and I know there's something toxic in there, seriously? There's preschool that is less than 1,000 feet, 0 to 3 and 5-year-olds, a Head Start preschool. It is as close as you possibly can get to that pesticide plant that has been cemented over. A school as well. Anyway, these are questions I just kind of leave open. So thank you.
Do any of our panelists want to respond to the question of transparency and how we can encourage transparency?
Yeah, I think so. We're going to work with our consultant team on, and the information gathering we do here today, right, and all of our engagement activities is there's map sites that, are already known, and then we do anticipate that there may be some unknown sites and we may need to collect additional information. So we have been talking to our consultants about setting aside a budget that come up during these community conversations so that we can do some further research. Maybe it's through Sanborn maps or some additional analysis. But we also want to figure out, and I know BCDC has done a really good job about putting these publicly accessible databases. So we're going to look for opportunities as well to make our data that we collect through this process available to you all, as well as maybe some online interactive tools where you can map sites that you believe or suspect so that we can also do some additional research. But certainly we're going to encourage all property owners as well as residents in the city to participate in the process. And, let's just hope there's interest on all sides.
Great, thank you so much. Can I get another round of applause for our wonderful panelists? Okay, so that is all the time we have for questions. We will now have a break for refreshments out in the lobby, and we'll return at 2:30. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. We will actually be breaking till 2:40 because we're a little bit ahead of time. So please be back for panel 2 at 2:40. Thank you.
it'll go back.
Okay, if everyone could find their seats. And just so you know, these mics are Hello. Please find your seats. Thank you so much. We're going to get started in just a minute.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, so, right?
I think you're right after me, Sharon.
Oh, actually,
no, after
you're after
Christina.
Christina. Okay.
When I only have
Okay, please go ahead and find your seats, folks. We're going to get started in just a minute. Okay, welcome back, everyone. Hope you had a good break and refreshments. We are now going to jump into our next panel, which is titled Finding Out About the Richmond Shoreline. Our panelists are Richmond City Council member Gail McLaughlin, UC Berkeley professor Dr. Christina Hill, Richmond Shoreline Community Advisory Group member Sherry Paget, Principal Consultant of Merkel and Associates Keith Merkel, and Senior Design Manager of the San Francisco Estuary Institute, Katie McKnight. Please give a warm welcome to our second panel. Great. Now I will turn it over to Councilmember Gail McLaughlin to discuss heavy industry leftovers, taking stock of toxins on our shoreline. Let's have another round of applause.
Thank you so much, Julia. And thank you to everyone for being here today. It's such an important topic. I want to start out by thanking both Sally Tobin and Pam Stello, two of our community shoreline experts who really worked hard to get this off the ground. Sally came up with the idea of this Shoreline Summit and also brought forward the idea of the city applying for this Ocean Protection Council grant and helped write it. And of course, we got that grant. So thank you, Sally. Thank you, Pam. Thank you, city staff, for all your work. Thank you to the consultants that we have. The city has hired Methune, as was mentioned, and Graham Prentice and his team are here today. Graham, you want to raise your hand? Okay, he's with Methune. He will be working on this plan, as well as Jeff Catan and his team, who's also here, raised his hand. Thank you, Jeff, and for you being here and for your team as well. All right, so let me get started here. I just want to share some basic understanding of where we're at with our shoreline, and others will go a little deeper than me. I do want to say that, I'm Gail McLaughlin, a city council member. I've been involved in the city and in the shoreline issues going back to actually before I was on council. I first got on the council in 2005, so my first campaign was 2004, and that's when I first learned about our shoreline, and mainly from Sherry Padgett, who's here today, and she's a wealth of information, as you'll see later. I also served 8 years as mayor and was very involved with our Southeast Shoreline area community advisory group that advises DTSC on shoreline issues and these toxic issues in particular, Zeneca, but also other toxic sites on our shoreline. So I have a long history with looking at our shoreline, with the problems we have and how we can move forward. So one thing I did in June of 2023 was bring forward this agenda item that said that we need a sea level rise adaptation and resiliency plan with a toxic inventory, an inventory of the toxic sites on our shoreline. And the council unanimously supported that item, and that's what led to us getting these consultants on board, and will eventually bring forward our plan with our toxic inventory. So I'm going to focus on the toxic inventory that this plan will produce. So as stated in this first title slide, heavy industry leftovers, taking stock of toxins on our shoreline. That's what we need to do. We have some information, we have a lot of information perhaps, but we likely have more information to gather as well. So let's see if I can do this right. Yes, so we have 32 miles of shoreline in Richmond. That's more than any other city along the San Francisco Bay. And our extensive shoreline adds so much beauty to our city, as well as opportunities for recreation and other healthy activities. However, we also have a history of heavy industry along our shoreline. Many of these industries have long since moved out of Richmond. Of course, we still have Chevron and a couple other heavy industry firms, but a lot of them have moved away from our city. However, what they did is leave their toxic legacy behind. So as the climate crisis continues to deepen, we in Richmond are faced with increased problems surrounding these toxic sites. So here's a basic overview, an aerial shot of our shoreline area with hidden dangers. So it's a beautiful site, and we have a beautiful bay trail. People walk along the bay trail all the time, but there are deep, deep issues underneath the surface that we need to examine and be aware of. So a bit of our history of heavy industry. So given the enormous number of toxic sites on our shoreline, other cities likely don't have, who have shoreline, likely don't have this level of toxicity along their shoreline. But this not only creates a problem in terms of flooding. I mean, we are concerned about flooding with sea level rise. That's going to hurt our infrastructure and also homes like in Marina Bay along the shoreline. But we're also very concerned about the spread of toxins triggered by sea level rise and rising groundwater. And we'll hear from Dr. Christina Hill a little bit about what this rising groundwater, how that can impact the health of the environment and people. So what happens, and I'm giving you my very short thing, you'll get more from Dr. Hill. The groundwater, in sea level rise, the ground level rises as well. And then the upper level of the groundwater makes contact with the toxins and mobilizes these dangerous toxins along our shoreline into surrounding sites and into the bay. And of course, earthquakes and liquefaction exacerbates this mobilization of toxins and harmful impact on us as a community and on our resources. So the next slide talks about how on July 11th, 2023, the council made an action. That's the item I brought to the council. And we passed a motion directing staff to circulate an RFP to contract with a shoreline consultant for the creation of a shoreline resiliency plan with inclusion of an inventory of toxic sites on our shoreline. Since then, as I mentioned, the City Council has contracted with Methuen and also ESA to create this plan as well as the toxic inventory. So they're charged with coming up with strategies to address sea level rise with a high priority for nature-based solutions. And I think we're going to hear from Katie about some of those nature-based solutions later on this afternoon. And we also will have the consultant teams create the inventory of toxic sites. And again, this presentation is focused on the toxic sites in particular. Now, this next slide is one of a map. This is from Envirostore, DTSC's collection of documents, DTSC being the Department of Toxic Substance Control under Cal EPA. And as you can see, all those dots are toxic sites. And if you look in the southeast area, you can see that this is the most toxic part of the shoreline. That's why this is so critical. I mean, our whole shoreline is important, and there is toxicity in other parts of the shoreline. But if you look toward the bottom, the southeast part is really, really heavily contaminated. So we really need to give attention where it's due, and that's those areas that includes the heavily toxic Zeneca site, but other sites as well. And the next slide is going to talk. So this next slide, it just gives some example of some known toxic sites along the water's edge. Zeneca, or which also used to be Stauffer Chemical, now it's called Campus Bay. And this is a Superfund qualified site with hundreds of extremely harmful toxins from 100+ years of industrial manufacturing that left an unlined, capped toxic dump in place along our shoreline. That's really important to know. I had the opportunity when I was mayor to go visit visit Ecuador and the contamination of the Amazon rainforest there. And they also have these open, unlined pits that this is petroleum products and wastewater from Chevron and Texaco at the time that left behind. So this is not something that, this unlined type pits is not something that is only in Richmond on this Zeneca site. It's a real problem that entities, and we want DTSC to understand that we are concerned about unlined pits because toxins can move and mobilize away from the site and further impact other sites, the bay, our infrastructure, et cetera. So we really are concerned about the Zeneca site, but we're also concerned about UC Field Station, which is right next to Zeneca, and that has mercury and other harmful toxins on site. And then there's Blair Landfill, which has radioactive waste. Liquid Gold has metals and petroleum hydrocarbons. Biorad has chloroform continuously pumped out, and they don't even know the source of the chloroform. United Heckathorn is a Superfund site with DDT, is that right? Yeah, DDT in it. And Marina Bay. Marina Bay has residents. It's a residential development area. It's built on fill and has capped toxins, so we're concerned about that as well. Point Isabel in the Richmond Annex area has buried lead battery casings. There's a lot more. I hope I got a lot of this right. Sherry is more of the expert on toxins at various sites on our southeast shoreline. But that was just a basic, some set examples that give you an idea. Okay, so what are we missing? That's another question. So while our regulators, DTSC, the Water Board, and EPA have documented numerous toxic sites on our shoreline, given the high levels of heavy industrial use, are there sites that have not yet been identified? Some of us are very concerned about that because when you think of 100 years of heavy industrial manufacturing on a shoreline, on various parts of the shoreline, side by side, often one manufacturing site and another manufacturing site, there is undoubtedly a lot of toxins that maybe have not been identified, sites that have not been characterized yet as to what might be on their site, and sampling would need to be done to find out more. So we need to really look at any other toxins that have yet to be identified by our regulators. So of course we want our regulators to partner with us in this. So part of the charge of this sea level rise toxic inventory plan is to identify any potential other toxic sites. So we also want to start looking at what we want from this plan. And so I'm so glad our consultants are here because I could, I wrote an agenda report to the item, and I hope that gets utilized as some guidance perhaps, and of course engagement with the community, which will provide further guidance. But I kind of drew up 4 basic next steps. We want in terms of how the plan should bring forward better understanding. We should identify all contaminated sites along our shoreline. We should name all toxins at each site so we know what toxins are there and what are the threats to our health and the environment posed by each toxin. We also want to indicate what stage of cleanup exists at each site and how much or if further cleanup is needed. We, in addition, want to identify responsible parties for the cleanup of each site, like Zeneca for the Campus Bay site, like also Stauffer Chemical. Stauffer Chemical did years of manufacturing at the Campus Bay site. So we need to identify those responsible parties and put the word out that they need to fund clean. They need to put money into this leftover toxins that they have left for us in Richmond to deal with. And the sixth item, whoops, and I guess I didn't turn here. Okay, sorry about that. So those are the 6 points. On the 6th one right now, protective measures for the community while toxins remain on site. We know these toxic sites will not be cleaned up immediately. So will they get cleaned up before sea level rise reaches a level that they start to mobilize and cause more harm for us? And if so, what kind of protective measures for the community can we put in place while the toxins remain on site? So one other thing that this plan needs to do is to have outreach done to the regulatory agencies. I know DTSC is here. Good to see you, Ian. And also outreach to our shoreline groups. We have multiple shoreline groups in the city: Richmond Shoreline Alliance, Point Melati Alliance. We have CES, which is Citizens for East Shore Parks. Yeah, and so they have been very active in our shoreline issues as well. But we also need science-based experts, and we'll be hearing from some after I speak. And we need the people that are well acquainted with our shoreline and its challenges. We don't want people kind of to just look at us from afar and think they have the answer. We need people who knows what we've been dealing with for so long in Richmond. And of course, we need that local neighborhood and community groups to keep them updated and gather their input. So that's kind of where we're at, and I'm going to the last slide right now. So what are the outcomes that we're seeking? So I thought this was a beautiful photograph of our shoreline, and it gives the beauty that we're all going for. We want the beauty on the overall view, but also making sure the safety underneath. So the 4 outcomes we're seeking is a resilient shoreline environment for people and a living bay. We need to prioritize nature-based solutions to reduce risk of toxic exposure to nearby residents and toxic leaks into the bay. We need to build social resilience within the community, and we need to build capacity for future generations to adapt to climate change and enjoy our shoreline for rest, relaxation, and recreation. So with that, I will turn over the microphone to the next speaker. Thank you.
Wonderful. Let's hear another round of applause for Councilmember McLaughlin. Thank you. Now we will hear from Dr. Hill about Richmond underground, sea level rise, and the risks of rising groundwater.
Thank you, everybody. I just wanted to start by saying that we are seeing evidence of groundwater rise in the Bay Area already. And so it's not something we're talking about for 2050. We are seeing a difference, and that's partly because there have been a couple of heavy rainfall winters, and groundwater responds really quite quickly to rainfall. So we've seen it rise in part because of rainfall, and in part because the relationship between high tides and our infrastructure is beginning to change. This photo is from San Leandro on Marina Boulevard. So when it's a high tide, an extra high tide, king tide, you can go down to Marina Boulevard and see it already happening. And it's an area where there's pumping, so there are other interactions happening as well. But we know that groundwater is coming up. The Dutch have been planning for rising groundwater for 50 years at least, and they think of it as one of the 4 main sources of flooding. And this is from a study for Rotterdam in 2009. And they were already on Water Plan 2.0 in 2009. So we're a little behind, but we can catch up. We can leapfrog into best practices. So water for flooding comes from rivers, the ocean, rain, local rain, and groundwater. And a lot of people in California think of groundwater as that thing we don't have enough of. But actually, this is the kind of groundwater that we will have too much of. It's that kind of groundwater when you dig down in the sand at the beach and you find water in the sand moving towards the ocean. That's really shallow, what we call in geology, unconfined groundwater. It's at the surface almost. It's the saturated zone in the soil where rain accumulates between particles of soil. And the top of that zone where the rain accumulates between those particles is called the water table. And it's separate from the water that we tap at deeper levels to use for drinking water or even irrigation water. We typically don't use this shallow groundwater for anything because it's dirty. It has everything that runs off of streets and yards, and it's a problem that it's so dirty, but that's why we haven't mapped it as a resource until very recently. We've begun to map it as a hazard. This is from the U.S. Geological Survey, and they use this diagram to explain, you can tell it's about an East Coast city because the ocean's on the wrong side. That they use this diagram to explain that the ocean kind of sticks its toe under the land. That salt water extends under the land in the volume that is our Earth. And the fresh water sits on top of it because it's less dense. And as the ocean gets deeper, it actually exerts more pressure on that saltwater toe, which we call the saltwater wedge in groundwater mapping. That saltwater wedge will push further inland and upwards, and that will push freshwater groundwater upwards. So that's what's happening. It's happening very slowly, as sea level rise is here in California compared to other parts of the country. It's been very slow. But it is happening, and it is inexorable. It will happen. And there's really very little we can do to stop groundwater from rising. So the reason why it's so important, looking at it as a kind of international problem, as well as a U.S. problem, as well as a California problem and a San Francisco Bay problem, is that people have not had to design coastal structures in the past for a permanent higher sea level and a permanent higher groundwater. When sea level rises and groundwater equilibrates or reaches an equilibrium with the sea, it's going to be higher. And we haven't had the design for that before. So levees were developed as a strategy for temporary high water, not for permanent high water. So we have to rethink this idea that levees are going to fix all these problems. If the water was high for a weekend, yes, the levee would prevent most of that water from causing flooding. But when the ocean water comes up permanently, it'll be different. And this is a cartoon I use. It's not, in some ways, not technically accurate, but as a cartoon, I think it helps tell the story. It's a levee in front of a road with a sewer pipe, either storm or sanitary pipe, under the road, a dry creek bed, and some contaminated soil capped with a parking lot. So those are the elements. And as that darker blue water, which represents the sea as it rises, it pushes up the lighter blue water, and it can inundate contaminants that are currently dry. And just being inundated doesn't mean it's mobilized. So I just want to stress, it can be inundated and sit there like in a pond, because some contaminants don't move very fast. But in any case, it'll change conditions at these contaminated sites. And it will enter sewer pipes. And this is all happening now. So we're already seeing some of these things occur. And there is infiltration happening to sewer pipes. Rising groundwater could discharge to creek beds and cause more water to be in creeks in the dry season, or it can continue to rise in the soil around it. Eventually, we'll see more water in creek beds, more water in contaminated sites, more water in sewer pipes. And all of this is happening, and eventually you get to surface flooding, spot flooding. But by that time, a lot of other things have happened, which I'll describe super briefly. And you can see the levee is there. It's in place, it's present, it's not keeping this from happening. The city of Richmond, my first degree is in geology, so to me, the entire world story always starts with geology. The city of Richmond is a delta. It's been formed by different positions Wildcat Creek has taken over time. It's like there's a many-fingered hand lying over Richmond, and under the surface, that's the thing that matters. Those fingers are going to drive a lot of the way water moves in Richmond, because those old riverbeds, sometimes called paleo channels, have sorted gravels and sands in them, because that's what water's good at. It sorts particles by size. So as it reaches the shoreline and as it interacts with groundwater, groundwater will often be moving faster in those fingers. Rainwater will enter those fingers and move faster and potentially elevate groundwater at the ends of those fingers where they hit the artificial fill along the shoreline or other barriers. So groundwater can be elevated in these paleo channels, and rainwater can move faster through them as a kind of preferential pathway. I have looked a lot at the South Shoreline because although I understand why people are saying that the marsh on the North Richmond shoreline is vulnerable, houses and infrastructure systems and contaminated soils are more vulnerable in the South Richmond, South Shoreline area, I would say. That's my assessment after looking at this for a few years. These red circles are all open contaminated sites, meaning that they're still being managed administratively. They haven't been closed, and people haven't said, okay, microbes will take care of that, we can walk away. They still have enough contaminant there that they're open administratively. And there are a lot of them. And that light blue shows where groundwater is rising. It's in a 3 foot of sea level rise scenario, which is now considered kind of a really good case for 2100. I've been on the state's sea level rise task force, so we're talking about potential of 6 feet by 2100 also, and a foot or two by 2050, probably more like a foot. So these areas that are contaminated are in the area where groundwater is rising over that saltwater wedge and a little bit beyond. And these paleo channels come down to the contaminated shoreline. So that means that you could see an elevated groundwater at the ends of these fingers, and there'll be slightly different dynamics in those locations than there will be elsewhere. This is the Zeneca site. So my text is a little bit off the slide, but it's just showing the Zeneca site during a high astronomical tide in 2021. And you can see the tide is right up to pretty much the level of the lagoons. So there may be some hydraulic conductivity, I don't know. It looks to me like there could be. But I know that if materials from Zeneca were to be mobilized, and I'm not saying that they have been, if they were to be mobilized, and that whole area, not just Zeneca, but the UC Berkeley site next door, or the Blair landfill, or the liquid gold site to the right of that, if they're mobilized, they could follow these little hair-like pathways, because they would probably flow down the groundwater surface. In the future, that groundwater surface could be flatter. So in the future, when that groundwater surface is flatter, because the ocean has risen, it could be that somebody starts pumping. There is pumping to protect 580 already. So what would happen if the groundwater surface gets flatter with sea level rise is that those contaminants could actually change their flow direction and flow towards the highway, or flow towards the Panhandle Annex, or flow towards Crescent Park. So we need to be aware of where the contaminants are and what the groundwater table looks like so that we can begin to anticipate where these contaminants are going to go. And there are always surprises. I happened to be at this site, I think it was 2022, that winter storm, because I'm one of those people who goes outside when it's raining a lot and looks for problems. There are a few of us. And I went to this lagoon and I saw that. I'll show you a quick, turn the sound off, it's not valuable. Just going to show you a quick video of what I saw there. That lagoon is right behind this fence, and water was coming out of the lagoon and flowing into a Richmond sewer inlet. So the city sewer is receiving water from that lagoon. Luckily, at a time when there was so much water in the lagoon that it probably was pretty dilute. Whatever was in there was a small amount of waste, hopefully, and a lot of water. But that's an unexpected connection. The other unexpected connections that have happened in other parts of the country are that when a volatile organic compound, sometimes called a VOC, gets into a sewer pipe or even just into the backfill of gravel around the sewer pipe, the gas component can travel uphill. This is the only pollutant. Well, radioactivity can travel uphill, but other than radioactivity, VOCs are the only thing that can travel uphill in a gas form. And the way we would have to protect ourselves against that is by making sure toilet seals have been replaced after 20 years, that wax seal under the base of the toilet, because VOCs can enter the air of a home or a school or a daycare through that cracked, aged toilet seal. Cracks in a foundation, stubbed old plumbing pipes that aren't closed off correctly. People have to know about this so that they can take care of themselves in their own buildings. High schools, daycare centers, all of these places have to check, because it could be happening like it happened in many places already, that the plume is unexpectedly under a structure. And this is not to say anything negative about, one of our regulators. There's stuff out there that they don't know about. So it's really helpful to look and see what's happening in your community. And I'm going to close just by quickly showing you this cross-section. One of the things communities can do in planning is to adopt inspection rules that will allow them to track what's happening to building foundations as a result of, and pumping as a result of rising groundwater. And this could happen just in a wet year. I'm just going to show a sea level rise version of why this might happen. And you can see it's higher sea level on the side of the drawing. There's some inundation of legacy contaminants under a parking lot next to a building. And the building owner has started pumping to protect that subgrade level. That pumping will potentially pull contamination towards the building and create problems for the people who are in the building. It can also do what's called upconing, where it brings the saltwater boundary up. And there's a big ratio. If you try to pump groundwater down 1 foot, you can bring up the saltwater boundary as much as 40 feet. And it should be deep, but in some of these places where pumping is occurring, it's become very shallow. And your building foundations may not have been designed to be in saltwater. That would be a different design than what many buildings have. And the likelihood of corrosion and cracking and allowing VOCs to penetrate is higher if the building sits in salt water, as well as the sewer pipes. So everything gets harder if it's salt water. Preventing pumping from happening in the city of Richmond is going to be important, at least unregulated pumping, pumping where you don't know how much it is and you can't include it in your mapping of the water table. And people need to start paying attention to their houses, schools, and other facilities that have deferred maintenance and have not had the toilet seals checked or the stubbed plumbing or the cracks in foundations. So I'm going to leave with this image because I think it connects back to what the Segurite people were saying. We're part of a planet, a living planet, and we need to understand how it works and not just focus on the shoreline itself. Building a wall or a levee is not going to keep changes from happening in this hand, where groundwater is already different. You live in a delta, and you have to figure out how to adapt like that. Thank you.
Can I hear another round of applause for Dr. Hill? Thank you. All right, thank you, Dr. Hill. Now we will hear from Sherry Paget about shoreline contamination in Richmond and its risks to people and the planet.
No, I don't. Yeah, bye-bye. It can go over here.
Because Katie will use it next.
Okay. Is that good? Can you hear me? Yes. Good. I don't have to shout. I'm Sherry Paget. I'm really glad to see all of you here and all of you who are at home or in your offices, wherever you are. It's terrific that you've joined us today. I'm a 21-year volunteer environmental activist focused on shoreline hazardous contamination on the Richmond Southeast shoreline. I'm 72 and a fifth-generation Californian. Here we are today facing an unprecedented social and political challenge requiring more of us than possibly war or the work of keeping our independence. We come together to figure out how to govern ourselves through the local impacts of a colossal global crisis at a local level. I welcome all of you to a lasting community discussion about rising sea level and groundwater on our shoreline. I'm not the sea level rise expert as some others here in the room are. I'm not even much of an expert at a lot, except that I do a lot of reading and I ask a lot of questions. I'm a steadfast volunteer who studies our commercial and industrial waste history by reading hundreds of thousands of pages of shoreline site reports. During more than 20 years of immersion into the details, sea level and groundwater rise became a reality. Now the two have converged, and the summary is, we have an oh so serious problem. Our shoreline has been filled in with hazardous material and waste during 150 years of industrial expansion. California cap munitions or explosives started in the late 1870s. The Shoreline facility was purchased by UC Berkeley to become the UC Richmond Field Station in 1950. Stauffer Chemical formed in the late 1880s to... Oh, okay, it went dead. Maybe I hit something. Oh, it's great. Formed in the late 1880s to manufacture sulfuric acid. and it was bought by AstraZeneca, ICI Americas, which changed its name to Zeneca, which is now AstraZeneca, one of the world's largest foreign-owned pharmaceutical and agricultural products companies in the world. AstraZeneca sold the property to a developer by the name of HRP Campus Bay LLC to build 4,000 Shoreline condominiums on the site. Chevron started in 1902 and is a global giant. Chevron's hazardous compound footprint at sea level is oversized and unmistakable. We have no grasp of how extensive the contamination is throughout the facility at and 2 to 3 feet above sea level. We don't know the extent of groundwater contamination throughout the facility, and we cannot know the potential for contaminated groundwater to reverse direction or find other paths of least resistance, as Dr. Hill described earlier, carrying the contamination to areas unforeseen. We have no characterization data. In 2000, Chevron was ordered by the San Francisco Bay Regional Water Quality Control Board to clean up hazardous waste leaking into Castro Cove at the north end of the San Francisco Bay. At the, excuse me. At the east end of Castro Cove, a very long earthen levee separates the cove and the San Francisco Bay water from an area of gargantuan open-air settling ponds. As one part of the cleanup order, a section of the settling ponds closest to the levee was drained, leaving a half-century or more of layered hazards in the shoreline mud. Since that time, the levee is being breached with king tides and atmospheric river tidal pressures, flooding the drained settling pond with San Francisco Bay water. Chevron settled with the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, to fund a partial restoration of the contaminated areas of Castro Cove, which is still ongoing. We have 150 years of known and unknown hazardous compounds at and adjacent to, nearby, and all of the shoreline. There is a direct and scientifically proven link between shoreline industrial hazardous materials causing environmental damage and illness to wildlife after exposure. Concerning hazardous materials that are at the surface and below ground, some are contaminating the groundwater. Compounds vary in their mobility. Some are gases and volatile. Some are radionuclides, which are stealthy, invisible, unscented, and silent. Some change character depending on presence of water, air, or other compounds. Nearly all of them are unhealthy or lethal for the wildlife, including airborne or underwater life. Scientists and engineers know it's a very big problem, and now is the time, right now, is the time for us, the community, to give them permission to think differently, creatively, outside the box, to solve it for us. Richmond's southeast shoreline area is about 1/3 of the 32 miles. I'm going to describe briefly the history of a site that in many ways represents the entire shore. Other contaminated sites don't have the same timeline, however, the legacy, spills, dumping, and burial are all very similar. The Richmond southeast shoreline has dozens of sites under current or prior cleanup orders by California Environmental Protection Agency. From Point Isabel, the prior dumping ground of lead batteries, to the Richmond Port United Heckathorn Superfund site, where U.S. EPA's first cleanup of DDT and dieldrin in 1985 has failed, to the point that Lauritsen Channel sediment, surface water, and tissues contain DDT and dieldrin at higher levels than after the first dredging. Fish in the harbor are highly contaminated, and there is a fish warning. Two storied sites share a 3,000-foot north-sound boundary and 4,000 feet of shoreline. Zeneca, now owned by HRP Campus Bay and the UC Richmond Field Station. Both were, I pressed it, I think I, yeah, it's my thumb. I have a big thumb. Sorry. Both have been occupied on the shoreline for about 150 years. High output industry, creating immense amounts of concerning and hazardous materials dumped directly into the San Francisco Bay. The 1900 original water line was delineated by a wooden seawall seen in this photo around 1950. 1948 aerial photo shows raw materials and waste piled high throughout the sites with unlined runoff chemical ponds draining directly into the San Francisco Bay. Seaport housing was constructed in the mid-1940s and lasted 9 years at the eastern perimeter of the prior Stauffer chemical plant. Extraordinary numbers of pesticides, herbicides, and fungicides, as well as electron beam furnace patents, are credited to Stauffer Chemical, originating from this site. Some of the pesticides are so lethal they have been banned around the world. Southern Pacific built a 1960 railroad spur without tracks. They stopped construction, which trapped runoff and limited inlets and bay water flow on the north side of Steege Marsh. Chemical ponds filled Steege Marsh north of the railroad spur. U.S. EPA declared the Zeneca site as a Superfund qualified site. Zeneca requested a voluntary cleanup agreement under Cal EPA. Cal EPA assigned the cleanup oversight to the San Francisco Bay Regional Water Quality Control Board. Their oversight triggered a change in jurisdiction to Cal EPA Department of Toxic Substances Control. You can see orange chemical ponds. This is as the cleanup is starting, orange chemical ponds, and this one is still in place in 2004. That's right on the shore and leaking right into the bay. Today, the 85-acre site is under a City of Richmond development agreement with new property owners, HRP Campus Bay, to build 4,000 condominiums on 60 acres of the capped hazardous waste. So that white area in this aerial photo would extend all the way up to Mead Street, which is just south of the freeway there. The waste is off-gassing and leaking, and as well as leaking into properties east and west and south into the bay waters. The range of compounds is not equivalent to the cleanup of your local dry cleaner or your local gas station. The accumulation of 120 years of chemical manufacturing waste is extremely complex. Within current laws, guidelines, and local zoning ordinances, our regulators approved a plan that allows dense high-rise construction of 4,000 condominiums, which assumes a complete concrete barrier over the site and injections into the contamination will reduce the soil off-gas or vapors to the risk of human health down to 1 in a million. Our regulators haven't completed their approval or factored in completely the effects of incoming sea level rise and the inevitable change in groundwater elevation and direction. Water is near the surface with current tidal influence and can be seen in the 2003 photos during digs. And this is from the UC Richmond Field Station looking east onto the Zeneca site. Water would rise and fall with the tides. I'm a founding member of the Community Advisory Group, and We are chartered by DTSC, Cal EPA, Department of Toxic Substances Control, and we do appreciate the opportunity to have a voice in or sharing our concerns about what is going on in these sites. Excuse me. We meet with DTSC, excuse me, at least 6 times a year and meet to review documents 2 or 3 times a month, including the Toxics Committee. And we had this box drawn up a long time ago to think outside the box, and it's really very relevant today. Joining with all partners, including the community, to look at different ways to solve the problems. And on this slide, I have 2 more after this. This is a cautionary tale. It's a cautionary note about regarding reliance on long-term institutional controls. Remedial action plan success relies heavily on numerous institutional controls and engineering controls, including underground barriers, capping, soil, vapor mitigation, fencing, and signage. Institutional controls have a life that is managed and passed on to numerous parties over generations. No financial assurance for indefinite management of institutional controls is available generally. Institutional controls management over many years has not been studied for evidence of documented success. The Richmond community's firsthand 30-plus year experience is repeating institutional control failures. In other words, we live it here in our community. The institutional controls are failing us. They're overdue, they're forgotten, ignored, underfunded, unfunded, unenforced, and unresolved contaminant exposures. And at the same time, we're all in the same boat with our regulators and our government, and we're all trying to go in the same direction, even as the waters rise. And so here we have some possible actions. It's not all bad. Maybe we can get out of this. Visionary political will, energy, and follow-through for adaptation to rising incoming water. Rezone shorelines to allow adaptation and protection plans for rising sea level and groundwater and related impacts of unpredictable spreading contamination. Oops, come back. Regulatory protections overhaul to allow swifter responses as rising waters continually change enforcement conditions. It's very hard on our regulators if we don't give them permission to adapt to the conditions as they change. California regional and local coordinated leadership to anticipate and plan for sea level rise impacts on contaminated shorelines. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Sherry, for that informative talk. Can I hear another round of applause for Sherry? Okay, we have 2 more wonderful speakers for you this afternoon. Our next speaker is Keith Merkel, and Keith is going to be speaking to us from Zoom. Keith is a principal consultant with Merkel and Associates, and he will be discussing Bay life beneath the surface. Let's hear it for Keith.
Thank you. Are you seeing the presentation?
Yes, we are.
Okay, good. Thanks. Thanks again for the introduction. And I'm going to shift gears a little bit and move off land and into the water and talk about eelgrass resources in the bay. And I know the caption is Bay Life Beneath the Surface, but it's a mighty big bay and there's a lot going on there. So I've taken a very small chunk of it, and I can't do justice to that resource issue alone, but I'll try. Just really quickly, let's let me go into eelgrass. Eelgrass is a vascular plant that grows along the shorelines in San Francisco Bay and up and down the coast in northern latitudes. It is considered to be a community forming habitat, and it's really valued for its high productivity, its function as a nursery habitat for invertebrates and fish, and its value for stabilizing sediment, and also structuring food webs and providing structure to the food web system. That's kind of the historic mantra for eelgrass. But in recent years, we've also come to recognize that there's an expanding fan base for eelgrass. Eelgrass has been recently recognized for the value in carbon sequestration. So effectively, it helps to control the increasing amounts of CO2 in the environment. It buffers ocean acidification. And then it also provides a benefit that we don't really think that much about, and that is the sediment trapping capacity to adapt to sea level rise. So effectively, as sea level rises and we get deeper and deeper water, eelgrass is one of those resources that captures and holds sediment to allow us to better track with the increasing sea level in the marine environment. So eelgrass in California is not evenly distributed. It's very spotty in its distribution. It's estimated that there's only about 16,000 acres of eelgrass in the state. And that sounds like a big number, but in community terms, terrestrial community terms, it would be considered one of the rarest habitats in California based on the acreage. And San Francisco Bay, which is where we're really going to pivot, is second only to Humboldt in the total amount of eelgrass, holding about 17% of the state's eelgrass resources. So when we think about San Francisco Bay eelgrass, there's been 3 major eelgrass surveys in recent years. There was a 2003 survey, there was a 2009 survey, and then our most recent survey, which is woefully out of date at this point in time, was an October 2014 survey. And the 2014 survey is really what I'm going to talk about in terms of the quantification of eelgrass right now. But it fluctuates widely between years, but 2014 is a pretty reasonable use or a pretty consistent year for looking at it over time. A couple of really quick points. This is actually Point San Pablo sticking out here, and this is one of the largest beds. This is the largest bed in the bay. When we talk about eelgrass resources, the area, unfortunately, this didn't, there we go. The way in which we map eelgrass is a combination of tools. We use aerial photography, true vertical aerial photography to pick up some of the eelgrass beds, a lot of drone mapping, but then we also use side scan sonar, which is what you're seeing here. And this area right in here, you notice that the detectable beds off the San Pablo Peninsula peter out, but because of the dark water and very turbid water, what it does is it effectively masks from aerial photography additional beds that extend further out. And you see this small dark patch here is effectively one of these patches in here. When you think about San Francisco Bay, as it indicated, there's 2,790 acres in 2014. Much of that is distributed along the northern portion of the bay. And this is the area within the city of Richmond or within the Richmond Shoreline region supports 70% of the eelgrass in San Francisco Bay, of which 54% of all the eelgrass in the bay occurs in one bed up along the Castro Cove, which is referred to as a Point San Pablo, Point Pinole bed. It's a shoal developed between those 2 points. And another thing that I wanted to get at really quickly here is if you look at the shoreline along much of the Richmond area, You see that it rises fairly steeply along the San Pablo Peninsula, so it does the same thing at Point Pinole. And then there's a small valley area in the Chevron area, Castro Cove, that's a more flat terrain. And then to the south in Richmond, you also have some flat ground, and that was just spoken about earlier. One of the characteristics of San Francisco Bay eelgrass is that it has an extremely narrow depth distribution range. So effectively 80%, 81% of the eelgrass in the bay occurs within a 1 meter wide depth band from about minus 0.5 meters to minus 1.5 meters. So effectively, you know, a 3-foot width of the shallows supports eelgrass. And then when you look at the total distribution, 99% of the eelgrass occurs within a 2 meter wide depth band from 0 to minus 2 meters, mean lower low. It's important to note that this is the narrowest distribution for major Pacific Coast eelgrass beds. And it's because of the high turbidity conditions that we have, the chronic influx of fine sediments from the delta. The large scale of the bay provides for continuous resuspension. And then we actually have a poor sediment expulsion and high wave environment, which pushes the top edge of the grass beds down while also maintaining its chronic high turbidity condition. So one of the things that I really wanted to focus on in this talk is what's going on with the bay and climate change and sea level rise effects and how that affects eelgrass, and why are we more concerned now than we were ever before. There's been a significant increase in unpredictable threats to eelgrass. A lot of the climate change effects that we're seeing are unprecedented in the recorded history. So in 2014, 15, 16, we saw the oceanic Pacific heat wave, marine heat wave, the blob, as it's been referred to, that generated the highest temperatures in multiple stations since the beginning of recording. And that warm water also triggered stress to the plants, which then triggered wasting disease. So we saw a lot of wasting disease, as does drought trigger wasting disease, and we've seen that as well. And then we're seeing chronic effects of sea level rise. So when you add all these factors together, we refer to it as climate whiplash. The eelgrass is being stressed by all different factions. And so we've been tracking the spread of wasting disease. Wasting disease is a naturally occurring organism or generated by a naturally occurring organism that's typically associated with a breakdown of dead and dying tissues in eelgrass beds. In the 1930s, it hit the East Coast really hard and decimated the eelgrass beds there, causing changes in the entire bay system. It caused movement of flight paths along the Pacific or the Atlantic Flyway, where the Brant geese moved to the central plains area and were eating lawn turf instead of eelgrass. And we've really, for decades that I've been working with eelgrass, it's around, but it's not ever been really virulent. And in about 2005, we started seeing evidence of virulence in eelgrass from wasting disease. And we've been tracking it through time. And what we see is actually from 2005, we've seen it expand. It's in San Francisco Bay. In fact, there might be a fairly significant wasting disease outbreak right now in the bay. We're seeing it in Humboldt Bay. So effectively, it's gone from being non-existent for a few decades, for lack of a better term, very, very low occurrence, to being really pretty common and prevalent. And the importance of that is really indicated by like the Morro Bay example here. In 2007, there were 344 acres of eelgrass in Morro Bay. By 2013, there were 13 acres of eelgrass in Morro Bay. And so that's a victim of wasting disease that really decimated the Morro Bay system. Now it's come back since that time, but we see these big declines that occur. And we expect that there are situations in San Francisco right now where that occurs. Is occurring at the present time. When you look at sea level rise, and this is just to illustrate the various curves, we're facing a tremendous amount of uncertainty for sea level rise. How bad is it going to be? What are the extents of variation that we're expecting is really unknown at this point, and many predictions are generated. But the bottom line is we really don't know how quickly we're going to rise and where we're going to rise to. And so we're in a situation where we're trying to plan, understand, predict, and respond to something that is as uncertain as the ramifications of those changes. The other thing is the effect of sea level rise on eelgrass varies depending upon the system. And if you think about the systems in California, we have the Northern California, which is a more or less undeveloped environment. It has generally shallow margins to the bays. It's got a lot of backland, undeveloped backland, gradual flats. It generally has a narrower distribution of eelgrass than the clearer water areas of Southern California, which are highly developed and modified bottomed, where you have dredge channels, recreational embayments, steep slopes, revetted slopes, and fast land or filled land areas. San Francisco fits somewhere in between these. And so effectively, if you look at San Francisco, you could take these two and push them together. We have both gradual flats and we have also very steep and developed environments. And so when you look at these environments and these differences, you can expect that if you push up sea level rise in Southern California, we have very little place for that sea level or for where eelgrass to migrate, but we also have greater capacity for depth distribution. So we won't lose as much as if we push up, and if we had a narrow distribution and pushed it up, we would lose quite a bit of eelgrass. In Northern California, when we push it up, in some places we actually see gains in eelgrass, but not much. And in other places we would expect losses. So to help us better understand where we're going with eelgrass in the bay with sea level rise, we've been working with the Audubon, California, and Kathy Boyer over at the Estuary and Ocean Science Center to develop a model to look at eelgrass in San Francisco Bay and the adaptation of eelgrass over time, both for the capacity to help guide restoration and predicted resilience to restoration, but then also to predict how sea level rise is going to affect eelgrass and how catastrophic or major climatic events, episodic climatic events affect eelgrass. And I put up a link here that I would recommend if anybody's interested in looking at this in more depth. By all means, please go to this link and take a look at it. This updates a model that we did back in 2003 to start this process in the Bay. That model was designed for the purposes of really steering the Bay-wide surveys at the time. And the work has been funded by Ocean Protectorate Council and also the legacy resource legacy funds. And then this little box in the bottom here, I just wanted to make it really clear that we put this on many of our modeling slides just to remind ourselves to be humble, that all models are wrong and some are useful. We do know that there's errors in the model. They overpredict in some cases, underpredict in others, but they do help give us an idea and a way to think about things going forward. The models are basically input driven. So we put in environmental variables into the model. Then we provide training data to say what environmental variable combinations would best support eelgrass presence or reject eelgrass presence. We use empirical data. This is Point Melody light data out of the Point Melody beds and outside of the beds. Light monitoring data. Then we also use a lot of training data from synthetic tools. What is the threshold and tolerance of eelgrass in different, to different environmental conditions. And then from that, we get outputs where we look at the predictive capacity. The darker the green in this case, the more likely it is to support eelgrass. And what you'll see is these really dark areas really are where the eelgrass occurs in the bay. And as you go lighter and lighter, then you get to areas that have less potential to support eelgrass. The current predictions from some of the modeling that we've been doing are here. And so the dark areas that you see in here are areas that are predicted to have eelgrass and have had eelgrass. The lighter areas have had eelgrass in some cases, but not all cases. The darker it is, the more likely it is to be a stable bed over time. So this is the existing current conditions for the modeled eelgrass distribution and conditions suitable to support eelgrass. When we go forward and look at sea level rise effects, what we're looking at here is the crosshatches areas that support eelgrass, have supported eelgrass in the past. And then the red areas are areas that are most stressed by a 0.3 meter sea level rise occurrence. So effectively, a rise of about 1.5 feet is what we're looking at here. And if you think about a more expanded sea level rise condition, like 1.22 meters, so effectively a 4-foot rise, what you see is that most of the areas of eelgrass are gone. And the areas I mentioned before, the area around Richmond, which is really the heart of eelgrass in San Francisco Bay, holding about 70% of all the eelgrass, really diminishes in value going forward because it has no place to go. The steep terrain of Point Pinole, Point San Pablo, and the shoreline areas really restrict the capacity to flood in, whereas the areas that still continue to persist are much more localized along the marginal shoreline areas and Richardson Bay, because Richardson Bay also has the clearest water, and therefore, even though it's pretty stressed in terms of its probability is diminished quite a bit, there's still some greater probability. So with this information and continuing the process, we have been doing restoration in San Francisco Bay in a number of locations, funded by many different parties: NOAA Restoration Center, West Coast Region, NOAA, State Conservancy, Coastal Conservancy, EPA, and so forth, the Corps, on down the list. And the eelgrass restoration program in San Francisco Bay is an undertaking that we've been doing along with Kathy Boyer at the EOS Center over at San Francisco State. We've been collaborating on that for several years. To date, we've managed to successfully restore 75 plus acres of eelgrass in the bay. We've established new eelgrass beds in different areas. We're currently working on further restoration. In fact, we're working on the restoration of the mooring scars in Richardson Bay now that RBRA, Richardson Bay Regional Authority, has worked into a settlement agreement with BCDC. We're now in the process of restoring mooring scars as boats are being moved out of those moorings, which is going to open up approximately 75 more acres of opportunity for restoration. And then one of the other things that's really important is this program has allowed for a lot of restoration research, management research out of Kathy's lab, student education and community outreach components. And so that's really what we're doing. And I've included these pictures of the restoration project at the top, and then a restoration in Newport Bay, because the truth is that the restoration in San Francisco Bay doesn't look like this on the bottom. This is what's happening. People are planting plants on lines laid out on the bottom, but this is what it looks like in San Francisco Bay. Where you basically are just planting in turbid water, you can't see what you're doing. So that's what's going on offshore. We are in a world of hurt in terms of eelgrass in the bay with sea level rise, and so we're looking right now and working on adaptation. But listening to this morning's talks and today's talks, it sounds like there's a lot bigger issues going on right in the shoreline area as well with contaminant spread. So that's what I've got. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Keith. What a great presentation. We are now going to move on to our last speaker, Katie McKnight from the San Francisco Estuary Institute, on using nature to adapt to sea level rise, what we can do. Can I hear a warm welcome for Katie?
Would you like the clicker, or do you want to use this?
Yeah, I'll take that. Thank you.
Beautiful.
Thank you, Christy.
Absolutely.
Okay, hi everyone. I'm really happy to be here. My name's Katie McKnight. I'm a Richmond resident, and I've also been working and living in this area for over a decade. I'm an environmental scientist and senior design manager at the San Francisco Estuary Institute, and I'll be talking to you today. It's a great segue from Keith's talk because I'll be talking about other nature-based adaptation options that we can think about along our city's shoreline. All right, so what I'm going to tell you a little bit about today is where I work, the San Francisco Estuary Institute, or SFEI, and then we'll dive in and talk about what we can do using natural and nature-based approaches. And then I'll just touch a little bit on, what I want you to take away from my talk moving forward, why your voice matters, and where to look for guidance. And then I'll share a few resources that we have to point you to find out more, since there isn't a ton to fit in 15 to 20 minutes. So, all right. Let's talk a little bit about SFEI. So if you've ever been to Costco, you've passed right by our office. We're right by Point Isabel Dog Park. We are a scientific nonprofit that formed in the 80s to monitor San Francisco Bay's water quality. And we've also have our roots in mapping the historical ecology of the Bay and really understanding what it used to look like and how it's changed to today. And our mission is to deliver visionary science to empower people like you all to revitalize nature in our communities. So you probably already know why we're here, given all the talks that have gone on today. We're here because climate change is happening, and with it brings flooding, it brings rising temperatures and increasingly severe storms. And you've probably already experienced this. If you've driven to work after a really big atmospheric river event, the highway may have been flooded. Or if you've tried to walk on the Bay Trail during really high king tides, there may have been part of the trail that has standing water on it. So we know that water is rising, and we have to really think about, how do we want to adapt our shoreline? Because we have a lot of big decisions to make. For example, we could build a really big seawall around the entire extent of our bay, but this future may not be exactly what we want because it may not encourage other options that can be better for both people and wildlife. So this is a historical ecology map of Richmond back in the 1800s, and it looked really different than it did today. So you can see here in this map that San Pablo Creek and Wildcat Creek used to drain onto this really extensive tidal marsh that actually connected the North Richmond shoreline with the Southern Richmond shoreline. So this is around the Riveter Museum. And then if you march up the shoreline, this is around the landfill, and the mudflats actually extended all the way up to Point Pinole. And so this was a really wonderful habitat that had also native moist grassland lower down near the edge of the tidal marsh and transitioned to drier grassland in the yellow here as you got higher in the watershed. And people, native indigenous communities, used this land for thousands of years and really lived in harmony with the San Francisco Bay ecology. Fast forward 200 years later, and our landscape looks incredibly different. We have a lot of industrial development that has been put on top of our marshes and mudflats. We have many commercial and neighborhoods and other businesses that have popped up all throughout that wet meadow and that dry grassland. And so, you can also see these little pockets of marsh and tidal flat that still exist, but they're much smaller than they used to be. However, it is really nice that we still have these beaches, these marshes, these mudflats that still exist, because they're a really great starting point to think about how are we going to adapt our shoreline. Okay, so now that you have a little bit of context around what the problem is and how much our landscape has changed, let's talk about what we can do to adapt. How can we prepare for climate change and sea level rise in a way that really improves our lives as Richmond residents and also protects our environment? So there are really two built approaches that we can take. So the first are gray solutions, and these involve things that are very hardened, so concrete, rock, steel. And these are often the default of what engineers typically think about, but I think that's changing, which is really exciting. And then on the other end of the spectrum, we have natural and nature-based approaches. And these really harness biological materials. They harness flows, water, mud, plants. And an example of this is a wetland or a beach. And these measures really evolve over time, and they're much more adaptable to shocks to the system, because that's how Mother Nature works. And then there's a third type of measures, and it's when we bring these two together and we create hybrid solutions. So I think Supervisor Joya mentioned a living levee earlier. That's a great example of a hybrid solution that pairs a hardened levee with a wetland and an ecotone slope. So for this talk, I'm just going to be hyper-focused on the more natural end of the spectrum, thinking about those hybrid and nature-based solutions. So before we dive in, I also want to mention, why should we care? Nature-based approaches really can make differences in our lives, and it has to do with the benefits that they deliver to us. So they help improve our quality of life by cleaning our water, making our fish safer to eat if you enjoy fishing out of the bay. And if you've ever walked on the Bay Trail, you've probably seen a lot of people fishing. They also provide food and wildlife for our resident habitat, for our resident wildlife, such as the salt marsh harvest mouse, pictured here. And because they attract wildlife and support such rich wildlife, they're also wonderful places just to experience nature, whether it's through kayaking or paddleboarding or swimming or just hiking on the Bay Trail. And these measures typically are much more adaptable and reduce and break up storm energy along our low-lying infrastructure. And our tidal marshes in particular can actually act as sponges and absorb water that's coming out of the watershed. And so over time, these measures can actually present a cost savings because they, again, can really respond to change. But the thing is, nature-based measures and solutions are not a one-size-fits-all approach. So it really depends on the place when you're trying to figure out, what can I do where? So as this example shows, on the left here, this is the Miller-Knox shoreline. And you can see that there are steep areas with these rocks that are lining the shoreline, which is typically indicative of much bigger waves and choppier environments that goes into deeper water. And on the right here, this is a picture of Wildcat Marsh. And you can see these are really broad marsh plains that slowly transition into shallow water before eventually transitioning to deeper water. And so you wouldn't want to put a marsh right up against this shoreline, but you might be able to do more here. And so we really have to pay attention to our physical setting and our development patterns when we're making these decisions about what's appropriate where. And so this is also where science comes in and can help this process as you get more into the RSAP and planning for an adaptation plan for Richmond. So at SFEI, we created guidance on what types of nature-based solutions you can do where based on mapping of these physical characteristics. And they're all great ways to think about how we can deal with sea level rise while also creating really wonderful benefits for people and wildlife. And this report, the San Francisco Bay Shoreline Adaptation Atlas, is all available online, and our data is also publicly available. So we've mapped 10 nature-based opportunities, things like building reefs near our shoreline, doing beach or tidal marsh restoration, and building more green stormwater infrastructure like rain gardens. But I don't have time to go through this whole list today, so I'm just going to hit a few of the highlights and walk through these 4 examples that are bolded. So let's talk about oysters. We can grow oyster reefs in our shoreline. Oysters are amazing at filtering our water, and they can help uptake and break down harmful nutrients, which left unchecked can lead to harmful algal blooms, especially when they coincide with dry, hot weather, which can kill the fish in the bay. So oysters can be a great way to help, get out in front of that problem. We can create artificial reefs using mud and local sediments and other materials where oysters can glom on and grow. And they also present a wonderful way to break up wave energy and start reducing erosion along that low-lying vulnerable infrastructure like our railways and our roads. So where are they suitable? Well, it turns out in a lot of our shoreline, and it has to do with water depth, salinity, how hard or soft the substrate is in the bay, and whether oysters exist nearby. And so just for context, this is where the Richmond shoreline begins, and this is where it ends around the Albany bulb. And nature-based solutions are already happening in Richmond, and I find this so exciting, especially being a resident and being able to be proud of the fact that our city is getting out in front of this. So this is an example at Giants Marsh, and it occurred 5 years ago. Many organizations came together in 2019, including the State Coastal Conservancy, the State Lands Commission, the East Bay Regional Parks, and many others, to make this project happen through federal and state funding. They created 7 types of habitat, including oyster reef balls, and they're just finishing up a 5-year monitoring report that's going to inform other nature-based solutions in our region and beyond. And this project created food for our wildlife, it's cleaning our water, and it's attenuating waves along the shoreline. Another opportunity is building more beaches in the bay. So beaches do a great job of knocking down waves, and they're ideal for protecting hardened infrastructure. We can place beaches in front of rip-rapped or rock-lined shorelines. This picture in particular is one of my favorite places to take my dog Bernie to the beach. It's right by the Marina Bay community. And the thing that I love about going there is it shows you, so the beach is here, and right behind it is a tidal marsh. And then behind that is the Bay Trail. And so all of these things are working together to protect that trail that we really enjoy walking on and experiencing nature in. And the other thing that I love is every time I visit, the slope of the beach here looks a little bit different. And that's because the waves that are coming up and the tides that are hitting it many times a day are shaping the slope of that beach. And that's an example of how these measures, these opportunities, are much more adaptable than if it was just a wall there. And then this is just an image of how we can pair these types of opportunities like reefs and beaches together to start working and thinking about many different ways of protecting our shoreline. And then the other thing I wanted to mention is that we have a lot of diversity in the types of beaches throughout San Francisco Bay. So up here at the top, these are sandy beaches, but we also have shell hash beaches, like ground up seashells. And we have a mix and also gravel and cobble beaches. So beaches don't all look the same. It really depends on the environment. And beaches are suitable also throughout a lot of the shoreline. The main places we found that they wouldn't work are places that we want to keep sand and mud out of. And those are in particular channel openings and harbors and places that we want to actually dredge and not put more sand and beaches there. And so you can see there's opportunity potentially to do a lot of beaches throughout our shoreline. And a third opportunity is restoring more and nourishing our existing tidal marshes and mudflats. So we mapped a number of coastal risks that each of these nature-based opportunities provide, and marshes by far provide the most. They help with storm surge, they help reduce erosion, they help with flooding from our rivers and acting as a sponge, and they also provide biodiversity benefits, climate regulation by uptaking carbon, and so much more, in addition to even cultural resources for tribes that live in this area. So where are marshes suitable? Well, as I showed you in that historical ecology map, they've been relegated to just a few spots, but there are some elevations shown here in the lighter green that are appropriate for tidal marshes, and we map these based on where the tides exist and where the tides meet the land and the tidal range where marsh vegetation typically appears. So we do have opportunities to restore more marshes in Richmond. And another thing I wanted to mention is the work that Methuen, ESA, and many others are doing on the North Richmond Living Levee project, where they've identified an opportunity to come up with a hybrid approach. The living levee that Supervisor Joya talked about, of when you pair this dirt slope in front of a hardened levee and then put plants on top of it, it's a ramp that marshes can migrate up onto as sea level rises. And then what they're thinking about is using using wastewater from the West County wastewater treatment plant after it's been treated. It has a lot of nutrients. So instead of just putting it into the bay, actually irrigating a slope like this and allowing those plants to uptake those nutrients and provide even cleaner water into our bay. And so this is still very much in the planning stages, but it's a really exciting opportunity where Richmond is getting out in front of this and is actually thinking about how do we build infrastructure like this that also can be wonderful places for people, where we can have trails and boardwalks and really enjoy the wildlife here. And then the last opportunity I want to mention is connecting our creeks to our marshes. So this was something that, typically our creeks and marshes evolve together. Our creeks feed our marshes by delivering fresh water and nutrients and mud and sand, all the ingredients that make up a healthy marsh. And when we're able to allow that sediment to come down, it helps build up an elevation at the marsh, and so it can help the marsh keep pace with a rising sea level. But the way we've developed our landscapes, we often cut off our creeks from our marshes. And so we've been thinking a lot about, how can we restore those connections? How can we reimagine our creeks feeding back into our marshes where there's space? And so one place that we actually at SFEI got funding from the Environmental Protection Agency to start up a visioning project where we're going to be working with the Watershed Project, the East Bay Regional East Bay Regional Park District, and many others, including the city of Richmond, to think about, how can we re-envision this shoreline? And one of the things I'm really excited about in leading this work is that we're going to be calling on community members and tribal leaders and government officials and technical experts and bringing them all together to think about how can we do this? Because as we've heard, some of these sites might be contaminated. We have a lot of critical infrastructure at the edge of the bay. It's not an easy question. So we're going to need a lot of folks in the room to think about how we get there. Okay, so now I just want to talk about a few ways and things that you can take away from today and think about as we move forward. So the first thing is that your voice is incredibly important. And that's because what we do, how we adapt, is largely paid for by our taxes. And you all are taxpayers. And so, it's really important that you have a say. Your voice matters. I also want to point out that while these problems or these projects, green infrastructure, it can't solve everything, it can really help improve our quality of life through accessing more recreation opportunities, through cleaning our water, through cleaning our air, and so much more. So I really want to encourage all of you to get involved, to ask questions, to speak up, because that's really how we're going to figure this out. And you all are experts because you live here and you know this place. So that is definitely important. And the other thing is, we have neighbors not too far away in Oakland and Alameda that are already really far out and ahead of this question of how do we adapt. And I want to make sure you all are aware of this, because I think there are a lot of lessons learned that we can be sharing between ourselves and our neighbors so we can face these problems together, because they're not just unique to Richmond. So under the city of Alameda's leadership, a coalition formed in 2021 between Oakland and Alameda. And since then, it's grown to over 100 representatives from community-based organizations, as well as tribes, as well as local, regional, state, and federal partnerships. And this group has come up with a long-term adaptation plan that calls on a lot of nature-based approaches. And they just applied for recently a $55 million grant. And so we'll see if they end up getting it, but I think they have a really good chance of actually having money in hand to start working on some of the most vulnerable sites that they've pinpointed from their adaptation planning work. And so, Oakland especially has such a similar history of environmental overburdening, of redlining, of environmental racism. So many things that have happened there have happened in Richmond. And so this can really be an opportunity where we work together, put our heads together, share ideas, share insights, share learnings, so we can get through this together. Okay, so where can you find more? I'm coming at you really fast with a lot of information, but luckily after today, you can dig in. You can go to sfei.org, check out our Adaptation Atlas page. We have a long report that talks about all of those 10 nature-based measures, in addition to financial and regulatory measures and so much more. We also have an interactive map where you can look at some of those things that I showed you, the data behind those measures, zoom in to the areas you care about, and look at what's potentially feasible. And there's also, BCDC has this Bay Shoreline Flood Explorer. There's a lot of different flood maps out there. This is just one tool you can use to layer on different types of flooding and start looking at what that potential inundation might look like in your communities. And then I want to close on a personal note. So I'm going to take off my scientist cap for a moment and put on my resident one. As I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, I've been living and working in this area for over a decade. And I'm also a fellow citizen, fellow taxpayer, et cetera. And so the health of where we live has affected me in small and big ways. So for instance, I used to take my dog Bernie here to Point Malate pretty regularly. And I eventually stopped going because so often he'd have an eye infection or an ear infection. And many times when I went there, the water just smelt weird and it looked weird. And it's right by the Chevron refinery. So, I started thinking it might be the water. I also walk on the Bay Trail near some of these dumping sites. And recently, one of my favorite spots that I go by a lot, it has been found out to have radioactive waste that was dumped in the 60s and 70s that I guess was forgotten about or maybe people didn't know about. And these types of things are particularly important to me because just a few years ago, I was diagnosed with an aggressive form of breast cancer. And so, I've thought a lot about how our looming environmental crisis intersects with human health. And, I did all my chemotherapy at Kaiser Richmond. And often when I drive to do my infusions, I'd have the windows down. And often the air just smelled like burning plastic. And it just was so sad to me that that is what our residents have to deal with. And when I was doing a lot of this chemotherapy, I also connected with a lot of people in Richmond. And I've learned that I'm not the only one who's gone through major health crises. And there have been many people who live in Richmond who have been dealing with multi-generational hardships that relate to our industrial legacy as a city. And so, I have just been thinking a lot about this, and I'm so grateful that all of you have shown up today to be here and talk about this. And I'm super grateful to our city council members and our supervisors and our electeds, because I think if we keep down this path and we keep showing up, I think we can really come to a place where we envision a better future for ourselves. And then I'll just end on a high note. What I hold on to at night is really a lot of hope for our future. So this is a drawing that my husband, Nate Kaufman, who's a coastal resilience practice lead at HDR, which is an environmental engineering consultancy. He made this drawing to envision what a future shoreline could look like if we advocate for nature-based solutions to move us away from that industrial legacy of pollution and ecological collapse and closer to a healthier future full of opportunities to connect with nature. So I hope you'll continue to keep showing up. I hope you'll continue to help us build a safer and healthier place for our children and our children's children. And with that, I'll thank you for listening and thank you for being here. And always feel free to reach out to me for questions. Thanks.
Thank you. What a powerful and inspiring talk. Thank you, Katie. Can I get a round of applause for our wonderful panelists? Okay, we now have a few minutes for our second Q&A. So I'll ask again, if you're in the room and you have a question, please raise your hand. And if you're on Zoom and you have a question, please use the raise hand feature. We'll start with in-person questions. Okay, the mic is coming to you.
I missed the first couple, 20 minutes of today's thing, so maybe I missed this, but I haven't heard any real reference to it that much. And so I'm curious about what collaborations or partnerships there are with federal funding sources that are potential for sea level rise.
I think we're looking for the opportunities for future funding. There's a lot of money right now coming under the IRA funding from the federal government, and they are doing it more as mitigation management and are looking for letters of support. But I think what we would like to do in terms of, we need to first adopt an adaptation plan, identify specific projects that we can actually implement. And there's complexities in these projects in that they may not be on property that we own alone as the city. So there may need to be some established partnerships and things like that, but we are certainly looking for funding. I think earlier Supervisor Joya was talking about potentially tax measures that get passed in the future. I know statewide measures. But on the federal side, I think it's really around mitigation management. And so that's where we're going to be looking at it from a sea level rise perspective.
Hi, thank you. I just want to mention that since you weren't here, it sounds like for the first part, this we did get an Ocean Protection Council grant for this plan, $1.5 million. So we are exploring every possible grant. This is more for the building of the plan, but the implementation of the plan will need more funding. So what Lena was saying is very, very true.
Thank you. Our next question in person, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. So I have actually a request and then maybe a question. And to give a little bit of context, I was on the, and I'm still following the North Richmond Living Levee Project community outreach. So I was on one of their workshops, a community workshop for about a year. And so we talked about only pretty much amenities for this project, so for the North Richmond Living Levee. We were not, and I was asking why, but I didn't really get a clear answer. We were not presented with what the last speaker and some of you have talked about, first contamination, issues of contamination on the seashore, but also the very different models or design for sea level rise adaptation. And I don't think in 15 minutes you had, and you did a great job, thank you so much, but you hardly had time to just bare the surface of it. And there's some really, really important and very interesting adaptive new models and designs that are coming on the market. And so I'm wondering, we're just mainly presented with the, living levee and ecotone, which are great, I'm sure, but we do have about 32 miles of seashore on Richmond, Point Richmond. Then if we count the whole of Contra Costa, it's above 90 miles of shoreline. So my request is for the future, if we could, when we have community engagement, if please the community could really be informed and given a sufficient material to really evaluate first the different kind of designs that are available and for specific locations, because as you said, one model doesn't fit all. So different kind, like the Sponge City model is extremely interesting, and we should really look into this, in my opinion, at least present some of those models to the community. And the second one as well, some of the, I received the preliminary budget for the North Richmond Living Levee project, and it was about 22 million. That's an estimate, very low estimate. It doesn't have hardly any of the amenities that we spent 1 year talking about as community, so they were not included. Nor was any mention of surveys for environmental studies, for contamination. None of this was included. So if we have at least $22 million for one project, and we have about 90 miles of shoreline, I think we should also be presented with some budget figures that are, foreseeable for the future. Thank you.
Let me just mention that, thank you very much for those comments, because that is something that was talked about in the organizing of this, that we really want the science understood here, and not just talk about community amenities. I mean, community amenities are wonderful, and once we get a plan for how to address the scientific needs of our shoreline, to clean it up, to prevent sea level rise from overtaking our infrastructure and other things on our shoreline impacting the community. We really need to get the science down pat. So we do understand that, and we want the public to understand that. So I think in the future more materials will come forward that will elaborate further on that. And I also want to state that it is true that different models for different parts of the shoreline. And like I know Dr. Hill stated that she disagrees with what was stated by, I think Supervisor Joya started saying that North Shoreline was the most vulnerable part, because some of us believe the Southeast Shoreline with the hundreds and hundreds of toxins is the most vulnerable. So that requires a different type of thinking and a different type of solution. So thank you for those comments. Oh, that's mine.
Thank you so much. I want to see really quickly if we have any questions on Zoom. Yeah, can we take one question on Zoom?
Oh, hi. I live in the Marina Bay, and I'm hearing about all these toxic chemicals in the area, and I'm wondering, how safe is it to actually live here? And, should I move? Should no one live here? That's how you can address that. Thank you.
I'm not a regulator, so I'm not going to say that I can speak with authority. I can tell you that I think there are 11 locations, maybe 9 or 11 locations where hazardous materials are buried within Marina Bay. They're in the parks, at Shimada Park, out at Vincent Park. They're in the street right next to what we call Area T. That's that open lot that you've probably seen along Peninsula Drive there. And hazards are under lead, is under the tennis courts. Lead and petroleum hydrocarbons, I think that's what they're called, are under the Area O condominiums. That would be the beach, I think. And there's a section in the street right outside the police department in Regatta Boulevard. And there's more over at the Harbor Master. There's a lead fill under the parking lot at the Harbor Master. So in summary, it's all been buried, and it's has a cap on it. It's checked every 5 years. There's one area in the park that on the western edge, it had not escaped its capsule, but it had spread some. The California Department of Public Health tested that area a number of years ago, and they gave it a clean bill for the residents in that area. So overall, I live in Marina Bay. Supervisor John Gioia lives in Marina Bay. I'm not saying that that's a testament. I'm just saying I choose to live there with all the knowledge.
Thank you. We'll do one more in-person question.
I'm wondering if this is to the issue of political will and mitigations that could be done. If there's any point in urging our federal, state, or local entities to use eminent domain to protect the habitat and also human health and infrastructure in areas, for example, the South Shoreline area with the Zeneca site being as terribly toxic as it is.
Do any of our panelists want to respond to that?
I actually like the idea a lot. Let me pass it along to others, though.
I think I have one. I was just going to say, I'm a big fan of eminent domain. I don't understand why, when this power is available to our local governments, it isn't used. And I understand it can be a political third rail, but sometimes you can buy properties and then resell them, like to a parks district or to someone else that might actually be able to do something appropriate with it and not something inappropriate. So, for example, the city of Berkeley just forced the sale of a purchase of land that they've given to Sogorea Land Trust that used to be a shell mound. So our local governments have the ability to purchase land when we have enough funds to do that, and then sometimes even resell them and recapture money. So I think that eminent domain is an underexplored option.
I agree. And I think if you look into solutions of sea level rise, one of the options is what is called planned retreat. And in those cases where the community decides that there aren't a lot of options to save the existing structures or the existing facilities, planned retreat is one of the options. And in a case of planned retreat with reluctant participants, eminent domain is an option.
Thank you. Unfortunately, that is all the time we have for questions. Hopefully you can find someone to talk to afterwards and chat about what you learned or what outstanding questions you may have. I want to thank you all for being here today, but I also want to pass it over to Dr. Hill.
One comment before we pass it over?
Yes, before I pass it over to Dr. Hill, I'm going to pass it to Councilmember McLaughlin.
Right. Thank you. I just wanted to make sure I already thanked our shoreline advocates, our consultants, the public speakers, and I mentioned city staff, but I want to give another shout out to city staff who were involved. Lena Velasco was on one of the panels. And she also was involved with helping to organize this. And I also want to mention, she's our community development director, Lena is. But we also have a new employee in community development, and that's Christy Ellerbrook. And Christy, please raise your hand. Yeah. Christy worked really hard, and we really appreciate her help in organizing this. So I just wanted to make sure I shouted out to them. I got it.
Thank you. Okay, now I'm going to pass it to Dr. Hill for a quick summary from today. Thank you, Dr. Hill.
I understood my task as summarizing this panel, so I'm going to focus on that. Already really difficult. So I think in Gail's presentation, she really emphasized how important it is for the sea level rise adaptation plan to look at all of the contaminated sites and to identify if there are any additional. And a whole series of other, identify the chemicals, identify the stage of cleanup and future plans, protective measures, and that the goal of the plan is really to make a more resilient shoreline for people and for a living bay and build community resilience and capacity. So that seems terrific. Really wanted to applaud her for, leading us with those goals. And then I was trying to emphasize that seawalls and levees will not prevent flooding by themselves. We have to consider the way that groundwater rise is going to cause more flooding. In fact, the USGS has estimated it's 9 times more area in California, particularly in the Bay, that would be affected than by flooding from high tides alone. And that the delta form of Richmond really needs to be addressed in adaptation with the old riverbed channels and in relation to contaminants and pumping, and that people can start to protect themselves by hiring a plumber to check their toilet seals,
But it's hard to push all that responsibility onto the individual people or elementary schools or daycare centers. We really need to have a view, an overview that goes beyond the parcel scale that our regulators are responsible for looking at contamination, not just what's in the parcel that they're taking care of. And then Sherry pointed out there's a very long history of contamination that sets the stage for current site regulation and planning, and that fish and soils are contaminated outside of the parcels where those contaminants may have originated before they were regulated. So contamination, the horse has already left the barn. There is contamination in the Richmond landscape that's not contained within the sites where it originated. And that the CAG, the South Shoreline Citizens Advisory Group, is trying to lead towards and engage people in a process towards resolution at those sites, and probably could use more engagement from the city of Richmond, its residents. And that the plan to develop the 4,000 homes on the Zeneca Campus Bay site would essentially cover up and lid over anything that's left after the cleanup has occurred. So it would be problematic, and my interpretation was she was saying it's probably the wrong direction. Keith emphasized that eelgrass is a key to food webs in the bay, and that the bay has the second most eelgrass habitat of any bay in California after Humboldt, that it provides a sediment trap, sequesters carbon, and buffers the increasing acidity of oceans. And then Richmond's shore has most of the eelgrass in the Bay Area. So whatever is done with adaptation might be done to assist in maintaining those eelgrass beds or expanding them in other locations. And then Katie closed out by reminding us all that mudflats once extended from the south shore of Richmond out to Point Pinole. That's our liquefaction zone in Richmond, the area that used to be these old mudflats. And that adaptation can explore hybrid solutions that are a mix of green and gray strategies. Doesn't have to be an either or. And then marshes could be a big part of that, but we have to pay attention to wave energy and not just put marshes in places where there's too much wave energy. And that they're looking at SFEI at 10 different nature-based strategies, not just marshes, from eelgrass beds to oyster reefs and rain gardens and beaches. Hard to argue against the need for more beaches. So I'll close you with that happy thought: beaches.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hill, for that very efficient summary. So thank you. I want to thank you all for attending this program in person and virtually, to our friends on Zoom. I want to give a special thanks to our outstanding panelists and our event planning team, including Lena Velasco, Christy Ellerbrook, Graham Prentice, sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name, Elizabeth Felter, Councilmember McLaughlin, City of Richmond staff, KCRT's Richard Lee, Erica Garcia for childcare, Letitia Organ for translation, and community volunteers for helping put on this event, including Sally Tobin and Pam Stello. Lastly, oh yes, let's have a huge round of applause for all of them. Yay! Thank you all. Lastly, I want to remind everyone to fill out the questionnaire. There's a QR code here, or there are, I believe, paper questionnaires in the lobby. You can share your vision and goals for sea level rise adaptation planning in Richmond. We really want to hear your voice, so please take the time to do that. Sign up for the city's sea level rise adaptation and resiliency page for updates and future meetings. And thank you so much for joining us today, and have a great rest of your day. Thank you.
And thank you to Julia for great emceeing. Great job, everyone.